When a pregnant widow's wagon breaks down in the dusty frontier town of Willow Creek, she thinks she's found the perfect place to hide from her painful past. Evelyn Hart carries more than just a child. She bears the crushing weight of judgment, loss, and a grief so deep it threatens to swallow her whole. All she wants is to disappear, to raise her baby far from the whispers and pitying looks that drove her from everything familiar. But fate has other plans. A gentle cowboy named Calder Beck offers her shelter in his stable, asking nothing in return, except honest work. His calloused hands tell stories of hard labor, while his eyes hold secrets of their own buried sorrows. Neither speaks of their pain, yet somehow they understand each other's silence. As autumn turns to winter, two broken souls begin tending not just the land, but something far more fragile, the possibility of healing. But can love truly bloom from loss? Or will their haunted pasts destroy any chance at happiness they might have found together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered platform of Millbrook Station, where steam still rose from the tracks like ghosts refusing to rest. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the wooden planks, her black morning dress a stark contrast. Against the golden light that seemed to mock her darkness, her hand rested protectively over the gentle swell beneath her skirts. 4 months along now, though she told no one the precise timing. Time had become fluid since Thomas died, measured not in days or weeks, but in the spaces between tears. The station master's weathered face creased with concern as he approached, his boots echoing against the hollow planks. "Mrs. Hart, you certain about this? That westbound ain't coming back through for near a month. Once you're on it, I'm certain." Her voice carried the weight of decisions made in the deep hours of sleepless nights. "There's nothing left for me here, Mr. Garrison. Nothing but whispers that followed her down Main Street like hungry shadows. Poor thing, barely 3 months married and already carrying. Wonder if that baby was the reason for such a hasty wedding." Thomas Hart always was one to do right by a woman, even if the conversations would halt when they spotted her, replaced by pitying smiles that cut deeper than any harsh word. She fingered the thin gold chain beneath her collar, where Thomas's wedding ring hung heavy against her heart. He'd been wearing it when the locomotive's boiler exploded, when twisted metal and scalding steam had claimed him along with 6 other men that terrible morning in June. The railroad company had returned it to her with their condolences and a settlement check that felt like blood money in her trembling hands. "All aboard!" The conductor's call pierced the morning air, and Evelyn gathered her traveling bag. Everything she owned now fit into one worn carpet bag and a small wooden trunk. The rest she'd sold or given away, unable to bear the weight of memories that clung to every piece of furniture, every curtain Thomas had helped her hang in their brief months of marriage. The train's whistle shrieked as she settled into a window seat, watching Millbrook shrink into nothing more than a cluster of buildings surrounded by endless fields. Each mile carried her further from the life she'd known, from the young woman who'd believed in forever promises and Sunday picnics by the creek. Hours turned to days as the landscape changed from rolling farmland to rugged plains. She ate sparingly, from the provisions she'd packed, conscious of every penny in her dwindling funds. Other passengers came and went, businessmen with important destinations, families heading west for new opportunities, young men seeking adventure in the territories. None of them looked at her twice, which was exactly how she preferred it. On the 3rd day, the train shuddered to an unexpected halt. Evelyn peered through the dusty window to see a small station sign, Willow Creek. The conductor made his way through the car, explaining that a rockslide ahead would delay them for several hours while the tracks were cleared. "Might as well stretch your legs, folks. We'll be here a while." Evelyn stepped onto the platform, grateful for solid ground beneath her feet. The town that greeted her was smaller than Millbrook, quieter, with wide streets that seemed to invite contemplation rather than hurried business. A general store, a blacksmith's shop, a modest church with a simple wooden cross, and what appeared to be a boarding house clustered around the depot, like old friends sharing conversation. The air here tasted different, cleaner somehow, touched with the scent of sage and something else she couldn't name. Freedom, perhaps, or possibility, ma'am. You feeling poorly? A gentle voice drew her attention to a tall man approaching from the direction of the livery stable. He moved with the easy gait of someone comfortable in his own skin, his hat tilted, just enough to shade eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "I'm fine, thank you." But even as she spoke, a wave of dizziness swept over her. The long journey, the meager meals, the constant worry, it all seemed to catch up with her at once. Strong hands steadied her as her knees buckled. "Easy there. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" She looked up into the kindest eyes she'd seen since Thomas died, brown like rich earth, with lines at the corners that spoke of laughter and sun. This had to be Calder Beck, though she didn't yet know his name. "I'm not sure," she admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. "Train won't be leaving for hours yet. There's a good woman runs the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson. She'll fix you, something that'll put some color back in your cheeks." Before Evelyn could protest, he'd guided her across the street to a neat white house with a wide porch. The woman who answered his knock took one look at Evelyn and clicked her tongue in maternal concern. "Land's sake, child, you look ready to blow away in the next strong wind. Come in, come in. I've got soup on the stove." As Evelyn found herself seated at a scrubbed wooden table with a bowl of chicken broth warming her hands, she caught sight of her rescuer through the window. He'd returned to his work at the stable, but kept glancing toward the boarding house as if checking on her welfare. For the first time in months, something loosened in her chest. Not hope, she wasn't ready for that yet, but perhaps the faintest possibility that kindness still existed in the world, offered freely by strangers who asked nothing in return. The soup filled her empty stomach, and Mrs. Patterson's gentle chatter filled the silence she'd grown too accustomed to carrying. When the train's whistle finally announced its readiness to depart, Evelyn felt an unexpected reluctance to leave this peaceful place. But her ticket carried her west, to a destination she'd chosen by closing her eyes and pointing at a map. As the train pulled away from Willow Creek, she pressed her face to the window for one last glimpse of the man who'd shown her kindness. He stood beside the tracks, hat in hand, watching her leave with something that might have been regret. She touched Thomas's ring through her dress and whispered a prayer to whatever force had brought her to this moment. Perhaps running away wasn't about reaching a destination after all. Perhaps it was about recognizing the right place to stop. The wagon wheels split with a crack that echoed across the empty prairie like a gunshot. Evelyn stared at the broken spokes, scattered now like the remnants of her carefully laid plans. 3 days out from the last town, with supplies running low and the baby growing heavier inside her with each passing mile, this felt like the final, cruel joke from a universe that had already taken too much. She'd bought the wagon and mare in Cheyenne with the last of her railroad settlement money, determined to disappear completely into the vast western territories. No more trains with curious passengers, no more questions about where a pregnant woman might be traveling alone. Just her, the endless sky, and the possibility of vanishing entirely. But now, with the sun climbing toward its merciless noon peak and nothing but scrub brush stretching to the horizon, that plan seemed as broken as the wheel beside her. The mare snorted and stamped, sensing her distress. Evelyn patted the animal's neck with trembling hands, trying to think past the panic rising in her throat. She could walk, but how far? And in her condition, carrying what little water remained. Dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached. A rider, moving at an easy lope that spoke of familiarity with these endless spaces. As the figure drew closer, recognition sparked in her chest. The same easy posture, the same gentle way of sitting a horse she'd glimpsed briefly at that little Depot Town weeks ago, Calder Beck reined in his horse 20 feet away, removing his hat as he dismounted. The same kind eyes that had steadied her on the train platform now took in her situation with quiet assessment. "Ma'am," his voice carried the same gentle cadence she remembered. "Looks like you've found yourself in a spot of trouble." "My wheel." She gestured helplessly at the scattered wood. "I was trying to reach Sweetwater, but Sweetwater's still 40 miles west, and most of it rough country." He crouched beside the broken wheel, running his fingers over the split hub. "This wasn't going to make it much further anyway. Wood's been dried out too long, probably cracked days ago, and finally gave way." The practical assessment should have discouraged her, but something in his tone suggested solutions rather than defeat. Can it be repaired?" "Not out." "Here." He stood, dusting his hands on his chaps. "But there's a town not far back, Willow Creek. Remember it? You stopped there when the train was delayed." Of course he'd remember her. Heat crept up her neck at the thought of how weak she must have appeared that day, practically fainting on the platform. "I remember. I've got a wagon back at my place. Could load your things, get you somewhere safe while we figure out what comes next." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "No obligation, you understand. Just seems like the right thing to do." Evelyn studied his face, searching for the ulterior motive she'd learned to expect from men offering help to women in distress. But Calder's expression held only honest concern, and the kind of patient courtesy her father had always said marked a true gentleman. "I couldn't impose, wouldn't be imposing. I've got room above the stable, clean, private, and Mrs. Patterson next door keeps an eye on things when I'm out working cattle." He gestured toward her obviously pregnant form with careful delicacy. "Seems like you might need a place to rest up before you decide where you're heading next." The baby chose that moment to shift inside her, pressing against her ribs in a way that made her catch her breath. 4.5 months now, and already she felt the increasing weight of carrying this child alone. The thought of a clean room, of safety, while she gathered her strength. "Just until I can get another wagon," she heard herself saying. Something that might have been relief flickered in his eyes. "Of course, whatever feels right to you." Within an hour, he'd transferred her belongings to his sturdy farm wagon and hitched her mare behind. The ride to Willow Creek passed in comfortable silence, broken only by his occasional comments about the country they traveled through, where to find water, which plants the cattle favored, how to read the weather in the shape of distant clouds. The town looked exactly as she remembered, perhaps a bit smaller in the afternoon light, but no less welcoming. Calder guided the wagon past the main street to a neat complex of buildings behind the livery stable. A barn, several corrals, and a modest house with a wide porch faced a smaller building that must be the stable he'd mentioned. Above the stable door, someone had carved a simple wooden cross into the lintel, not ostentatious, but clearly visible to anyone seeking shelter beneath it. The sight of it stirred something in Evelyn's chest. A memory of faith she'd thought buried with Thomas. "That room's been empty since my hired hand moved on last spring," Calder said, following her gaze. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak." He carried her trunk up the narrow stairs as if it weighed nothing, setting it down in a space that was indeed simple but spotlessly clean. A bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand with a mirror, a small table and chair positioned to catch the afternoon light from the single window. That window looked out over a kitchen garden where late summer vegetables still flourished, and beyond that to rolling hills dotted with cattle. "Mrs. Patterson usually has supper ready around 6, he said, setting her carpetbag beside the trunk. "She's been feeding me since my mother passed, and she always makes too much. You'd be welcome to join us, or I can bring a plate over if you'd prefer to keep to yourself." The offer of solitude tempted her, but the thought of another meal eaten alone in silence felt suddenly unbearable. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be." His smile transformed his weathered features, revealing the younger man he must have been before whatever sorrows had settled in his eyes. "Mrs. Patterson's been telling me for years I need better company at her table." This'll make her happier than a new bonnet. After he left, Evelyn stood at the window watching him tend to the horses with the same careful attention he'd shown her. His movements spoke of deep familiarity with the animals, the kind of partnership that comes from years of mutual respect and trust. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her toiletries on the washstand. At the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in tissue paper, lay Thomas's railroad watch, the one thing of his she hadn't been able to part with. She held it for a moment, listening to its steady tick, then placed it in the table drawer, where she wouldn't have to see it every day. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Evelyn touched the wooden cross above the door before descending the stairs. Whatever divine providence had led her here, to this place of unexpected kindness, perhaps it was time to stop running and allow herself to simply be still. The scent of fresh bread drifted from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed contentedly in their pastures. For the first time since Thomas died, Evelyn felt something besides grief settle in her chest. It might have been peace. Dawn came softly to Willow Creek, painting the eastern sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Evelyn woke to the gentle sounds of Calder moving about below, his boots a quiet rhythm against the stable floor as he tended the horses. She'd grown accustomed to this morning symphony over the past week, the soft nickering of horses greeting their caretaker, the rustle of hay, the steady pour of grain into feed buckets. She dressed carefully, smoothing her hands over the growing swell of her pregnancy. 5 months now, and showing enough that loose shawls couldn't entirely disguise her condition. In her former life, this would have been cause for celebration, for sharing the news with neighbors and planning nurseries. Now it felt like carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. From her window, she watched Calder emerge from the stable, a pair of worn leather work gloves in his hands. Those gloves had become as familiar to her as his quiet morning routine, cracked and stained from years of honest labor, yet somehow still gentle when he handled the animals or helped her down from Mrs. Patterson's porch after their shared meals. Morning, he called softly when she appeared at the top of the stairs, as if he'd been waiting for her to wake. "Coffee's on if you'd like some." This, too, had become part of their rhythm. She would find him by the small fire he built outside the stable, a dented coffee pot balanced on the stones, 2 mismatched cups waiting on an upturned crate. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, as he put it, but somehow perfect in the crisp morning air. "Thank you." She accepted the steaming cup, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "You're up early again." Cattle don't care much for sleeping in. His smile took any sting out of the words. "Besides, I like the quiet this time of day. Feels like the world's starting fresh, you know." She did know, though she'd never had words for the feeling before. There was something restorative about these mornings, something that smoothed the sharp edges of her grief into something more bearable. "I've been thinking," she said, gathering her courage, "about earning my keep here. You've been more than generous, but I can't continue accepting charity indefinitely." Calder's hands stilled on his coffee cup. "You're not charity, Evelyn. You're—" He stopped himself, but she caught the beginning of something warmer in his tone, something that made her pulse quicken despite her resolve to keep her heart carefully guarded. "I'm a pregnant widow with no clear destination and rapidly diminishing funds," she said gently. "However kind you might be about it, that's the truth of my situation." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. If it would make you feel better about staying, there's plenty that needs doing around here. Mrs. Patterson's been after me for years to get someone to help with the garden, and the stable could use a woman's touch when it comes to organization. I'd like that." The relief in her voice surprised them both, and so a new routine emerged. After their morning coffee, Evelyn would spend the cooler hours working in Mrs. Patterson's extensive kitchen garden, weeding between rows of late tomatoes and winter squash, harvesting herbs that perfumed her hands with the scents of basil and thyme. The physical work felt good after months of forced inactivity, and Mrs. Patterson's delighted praise over the garden's improved appearance gave her a satisfaction she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Calder would return from checking his cattle around midday, often finding her in the stable organizing the chaos of his bachelor existence. Bridles hung properly instead of draped over random hooks, medicines arranged by type rather than scattered across various shelves. The feed room swept and organized so supplies could actually be found when needed. "You're going to spoil me," he said one afternoon, discovering that she'd mended a torn halter and oiled all the leather tack until it gleamed. "I'll never be able to find anything once you've got it all straightened out." "Everything has a place," she replied, hanging the last bridle on its designated hook. "It just makes things easier." What she didn't say was how much she needed this sense of purpose, this feeling of being useful rather than simply an object of pity. Thomas had always handled their household's practical matters, leaving her to tend to softer concerns. Here, her contributions felt essential, appreciated in ways that fed something hungry in her soul. Their conversations during these shared tasks revealed layers she hadn't expected. Calder spoke of his cattle with the affection some men reserved for family, describing individual animals by name and personality. He'd point out a particularly clever heifer or a bull with a tendency toward mischief, painting pictures of their lives that made her laugh despite herself. "You really love this work," she observed one evening as they walked the fence line checking for needed repairs. "Always have." He paused to test the tension of a wire. "My father thought I was crazy, wanting to work cattle instead of farming like the family always had. But there's something about it. The freedom, the way you have to work with the land instead of trying to force it into something it's not." She heard the deeper meaning in his words, the philosophy that seemed to guide his approach to everything, including her presence in his life. He wasn't trying to force her into being something she wasn't pushing for explanations or commitments. She wasn't ready to give. As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, their routines adapted to the changing season. Calder taught her to read the sky for weather, to understand the subtle signs that meant an early storm or an extended dry spell. She learned to move around the horses without fear, to recognize their individual temperaments and preferences. "You're good hands," he said one afternoon, watching her stroke the velvet nose of his favorite mare. "Animals can sense things about people they don't take to just anyone." The mare whickered softly, pressing her head against Evelyn's shoulder as if in agreement. For a moment, standing there in the golden afternoon light with Calder's quiet, approval warming her more than the sun, Evelyn felt something she'd thought lost forever, the simple pleasure of being exactly where she belonged. His work gloves lay on the nearby fence post, and she found herself studying them again. Those hands had delivered calves and mended fences, had offered her coffee each morning, and never once made her feel like a burden. They were honest hands, steady hands, the kind that built things rather than tearing them down. When he reached for the gloves, his fingers brushed hers for just a moment, warm, calloused, real. The contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that her heart might still be capable of feeling something besides loss. She pulled her hand back quickly, but not before. She saw the flicker of awareness in his eyes, the careful way he stepped back to give her space. Neither of them spoke of the moment, but it hung between them like morning mist as they finished their tasks and headed toward Mrs. Patterson's kitchen for supper. The rhythm of their days continued unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted, like the first crack in ice that promises spring's eventual arrival. The first snow arrived earlier than expected, dusting the world in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Evelyn stood at her window watching the flakes drift past, each one catching the lamplight like tiny stars falling to earth. The baby stirred restlessly within her, as if sensing the change. In seasons, and she pressed her hand to the growing curve of her belly. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find Calder holding a steaming mug, snowflakes caught in his dark hair like premature silver. "Thought you might like some hot cider," he said, offering the cup. "Mrs. Patterson made a batch and sent me over with it. Says pregnant. Women need extra warmth when the weather turns." "That's very thoughtful." She accepted the mug gratefully, inhaling the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon. "Won't you come in? It seems wrong to make you stand in the cold." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, removing his hat and gloves. It was the first time he'd been in her small room, and his presence seemed to fill the space, despite his careful way of keeping near the door. "Comfortable up here?" he asked, taking in the neat arrangement of her few belongings, the way she'd made the simple space feel like home. Very much so. She settled into the chair by the window, gesturing for him to take the bed's edge as the only other seat. "I keep meaning to thank you properly for all this. The room, the work, the way you've made me feel welcome." No thanks needed. But something in his voice suggested her gratitude meant more to him than he let on. "Truth is, this place has felt more alive with you here. More like a home instead of just somewhere to sleep between work." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made her chest tighten. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a cocoon of intimacy that seemed to invite deeper truths. "Can I ask you something?" she said, gathering her courage. "That first day, when you found me on the platform, you looked at me like you recognized something. Not just my face, but something more." Calder was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "You looked like someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone." He turned his hat in his hands, studying its worn brim. "I guess I recognize the look because I've worn it myself. You lost someone." It wasn't a question. Her name was Sarah. The words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "We were planning to marry when I got back from the war. She waited 3 years, writing letters that kept me sane when everything else was madness. When I finally came home—" He paused, gathering himself. "Fever took her that winter. By the time I got word, she'd been buried for 2 months. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, not just for his loss, but for the way he'd carried it alone all these years. "I'm so sorry." That was 8 years ago now. He looked up, meeting her eyes with effort. "But some kinds of grief, they change shape, but never really leave you. They just become part of who you are." She understood completely. The grief for Thomas had indeed changed shape over these months, from the sharp agony of fresh loss to something more like a persistent ache, a background note that colored everything else. "Thomas died in a railroad accident," she found herself saying. "A boiler explosion. We'd only been married 3 months when it happened." Calder's expression softened with recognition and sympathy. "That's a hard way to lose someone. Sudden like that. No time to prepare. Everyone said I was lucky the railroad company paid a settlement." Lucky. The word tasted bitter. As if money could somehow balance the scales of losing the person you love most in the world. "People don't know what to say, so they say foolish things," he observed gently. "Doesn't make the words hurt less." She reached into the table drawer, withdrawing Thomas's pocket watch. The gold caught the lamplight as she held it, turning it over in her hands like a talisman. This was his, the only thing that came back intact. Her voice threatened to break on the last word. "I keep thinking I should sell it, use the money for practical things, but I can't seem to let it go." Calder leaned forward slightly, studying the watch without trying to touch it. Beautiful craftsmanship. He must have been proud to carry it. It was his father's and his grandfather's before that. A family piece. She traced the engraved surface with one finger. "Thomas always said he'd pass it down to our son someday, that it would become part of our family's history." "Maybe it still will," Calder said quietly, "just not the way he planned." The possibility hadn't occurred to her that this child might someday treasure the watch as a connection to the father they'd never know. The thought brought both comfort And fresh pain. People in my town, they whispered about me, she continued, needing to share the whole truth now that she'd begun. About how quickly I was showing, about whether Thomas had married me out of obligation rather than love. They made something beautiful into something shameful, and I couldn't bear it anymore. Their whispers say more about them than about you. Calder replied, his voice carrying quiet conviction. Anyone who knew you would understand that what you and Thomas had was real. Timing be damned. His certainty surprised her. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen how you honor his memory without letting it consume you. How you're building something good for his child even while you're grieving. That's not the behavior of a woman who married for convenience. In the soft lamplight, with snow falling. Beyond the window and the weight of shared secrets settling between them, Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp crack of ice breaking, but something gentler, like a seed stirring deep in winter earth, recognizing the first hint of eventual spring. From his jacket pocket, Calder withdrew a small, faded daguerreotype, its edges worn from handling. He studied it for a moment before offering it to her. "This is Sarah," he said simply. The woman in the photograph was young and pretty, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wore a simple dress with a cameo brooch at her throat, and her hair was styled in the fashion of several years past. But what struck Evelyn most was the happiness radiating from her expression, the look of someone who believed in good things ahead. "She's beautiful," Evelyn said, and meant it. "You can see the love she had for you even in a photograph." "I used to talk to it," he admitted, color rising in his cheeks. "During the worst parts of the war, when I thought I might not make it home. Seemed less crazy than talking to myself." She handed the photograph back carefully. "I talk to Thomas sometimes, not to his picture, but just out loud when I'm alone, about the baby, about what I should do next. I know he can't answer, but somehow it helps. Maybe they both can hear." "Us," Calder said, tucking the daguerreotype back into his pocket. "Maybe that's part of love. It doesn't end just because someone's not here to hear the words anymore." Outside, the snow had thickened, creating a white curtain that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. In the warm circle of lamplight, with their secrets shared and understood, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. The profound relief of being truly known by another person. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me about Sarah, for understanding about Thomas, for all of it." Calder stood to leave, settling his hat back on his head. "Thank you for trusting me with it. Not everyone gets a second chance at feeling less alone in the world." After he left, Evelyn remained by the window, watching his footprints fill with fresh snow. The baby moved again, a gentle rolling motion that reminded her she wasn't truly alone, had never been truly alone, since that brief, beautiful marriage had given her this lasting gift. But for the first time since Thomas's death, being alone didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like a choice she was making one day at a time until she was ready to choose something else. The knock came on a Tuesday morning when Evelyn was hanging laundry behind the stable, her breath visible in the crisp November air. She'd grown, accustomed to the rhythm of washing and mending, finding peace in the simple domestic tasks that connected her to something larger than her own grief. When she rounded the corner to see three women standing by Mrs. Patterson's front porch, her first instinct was to retreat. But Mrs. Patterson spotted her before she could escape. "Evelyn, dear, come meet some of the ladies from town. They've brought something special for you." Reluctantly, Evelyn approached the small gathering. She recognized Mrs. Fletcher from the general store and Mrs. Morrison, the preacher's wife. But the third woman was unfamiliar, a sturdy, middle-aged lady with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "This is Mrs. Henderson," Mrs. Patterson explained. "She runs the bakery, and she's organized something wonderful." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, holding a large bundle wrapped in brown paper. "We heard about your situation, dear, and we wanted you to know you're welcome here in Willow Creek. This is from all of us ladies in town." Evelyn accepted the package with trembling hands, unsure what to expect. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught. Inside lay the most beautiful baby quilt she'd ever seen, hand-stitched in a pattern of interlocking rings, each ring crafted from different fabrics in soft blues, yellows and greens. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly the result of many hours and multiple pairs of skilled hands. "We call it a wedding ring pattern," Mrs. Morrison explained gently. "Each ring represents the bonds that hold a community together. Every woman in town contributed a piece of fabric from something meaningful. A wedding dress, a child's first outfit, a favorite Sunday frock." "I don't know what to say," Evelyn whispered, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "This is too generous." "Nonsense," Mrs. Fletcher interrupted firmly. "A baby should be welcomed properly, with the whole community's blessing. Doesn't matter the circumstances that bring a child into the world. What matters is the love that greets them here." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow, but a gentle one. After months of feeling judged and found wanting, to be offered such unconditional acceptance felt almost too good to be true. "We also wanted to make sure you're getting proper care," Mrs. Henderson added. "Dr. Matthews is getting on in years, but he's brought more babies into this world than anyone else for 3 counties around. Has he had a chance to check on you yet?" "Not yet," Evelyn admitted. "I've been feeling well and I didn't want to presume." "You're not presuming," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You're being sensible. Let me send word to Dr. Matthews this afternoon. He makes rounds every Thursday anyway." And so it was that Evelyn found herself 2 days later sitting in Dr. Matthews' modest office above the barbershop, submitting to a thorough examination by a man whose gentle manner reminded her of her own grandfather. His hands were steady despite his age, his questions thoughtful and respectful. "Everything looks exactly as it should," he pronounced finally, helping her sit up. "Baby's growing well, heartbeat strong and steady. You're about 6 months along." "I'd say." "Just about," she confirmed, relieved to hear his professional assessment confirm what she'd hoped. "Any concerns, questions about what to expect?" He settled into his chair, clearly prepared to spend as much time as she needed. "I've never done this before," she admitted. "My mother died when I was young, and my husband—" She paused, gathering herself. "He won't be here to help when the time comes." Dr. Matthews nodded with understanding. "That's hard, facing something this significant alone. But you won't be alone. Not in Willow Creek. Mrs. Patterson's assisted at more births than I can count, and several other ladies in town have experience with these matters. When your time comes, you'll have all the help you need. And Mr. Beck?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Would he, that is, would it be appropriate for him to be involved?" The doctor's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Calder's a good man, one of the best I know. If he's willing to be there for you, I can't think of anyone I'd trust more to keep a steady head in a crisis. Of course, that's between you and him to decide." Walking back to the stable that afternoon, Evelyn felt lighter than she had in months. The baby seemed to sense her improved mood, moving contentedly rather than restlessly pressing against her ribs. She found Calder in the barn, mending a bridle by the light of the open doorway. "How did it go with Doc Matthews?" he asked, looking up from his work with genuine concern. "Very well. He says everything is progressing normally." She paused, then decided to be honest. "He also said you'd be welcome to help when the time comes, if you're willing." Calder set down the bridle, giving her his full attention. "Are you asking me to be there?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them had fully acknowledged before. Asking him to be present at her child's birth would mean crossing a line from kindness between acquaintances to something deeper, more intimate. "I think I am," she said quietly. "I know it's asking a lot." "It's not asking too much," he interrupted gently. "It would be an honor, Evelyn, to be there when your child comes into the world. I can't think of anything more important." That evening, Evelyn spread the community quilt across her bed, studying each carefully chosen piece of fabric. Mrs. Henderson had been right. She could see the love stitched into every seam, the hope woven through every pattern. This wasn't charity or pity. It was welcome, acceptance, the kind of embrace she'd thought lost forever when she fled her former life. She placed her hand on her belly, speaking to the child within, as had become her custom. "You're going to be born into a good place," she whispered, "surrounded by people who already love you, who've made you a place at their table before they've even met you." Outside her window, she could see light spilling from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, where the older woman was preparing their evening meal. Beyond that, the warm glow of windows throughout the town spoke of other families settling in for the night, other lives intertwined in the daily business of caring for one another. For the first time since Thomas died, home felt like more than just a memory. It felt like something she was actively building, one small choice at a time, one offered kindness gratefully accepted. The quilt beneath her hands seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the community that had created it, a rhythm that matched the steady pulse of life growing within her. She thought of the women who had contributed to this gift, women who barely knew her, but had chosen to invest their time and skill in welcoming her child. Their generosity humbled her and challenged her to think beyond her own pain, to consider what she might contribute to this community that had already given her so much. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Mrs. Patterson about helping with the church's charity work. If she was going to be part of Willow Creek, she wanted to earn her place not just through gratitude, but through service. The baby would be born into a world where their mother wasn't just a recipient of kindness, but a giver of it as well. The first real blizzard of winter arrived with a vengeance, transforming Willow Creek into a world of white silence. Evelyn woke to find her window completely blocked by snow. The stable below eerily quiet, without the usual sounds of Calder moving about his morning chores. When she managed to push open her door, she discovered why. A drift had piled against the stable nearly to the roofline, sealing her inside more effectively than any lock. "Evelyn!" Calder's voice came from somewhere outside, muffled by the snow, but clearly worried. "You all right in there?" "I'm fine," she called back, though the situation felt far from fine. "Just thoroughly snowed in. Working on it. Stay warm. This might take a while." She could hear him digging, the rhythmic scrape of a shovel against snow and wood. The baby, now active enough to make its presence constantly known, seemed to react to her rising anxiety with increased movement. She pressed her hands to her belly, trying to calm both herself and the child within. By the time Calder had cleared enough snow to open the stable door, the morning was half gone. He appeared at the top of her stairs looking like a snowman himself, ice crystals clinging to his beard and eyebrows. "Sorry that took so long," he panted, removing his hat and shaking off the snow. "That drift was near 8 feet deep. Never seen anything quite like it. You must be frozen through." Without thinking, she reached for his hands, pulling off his gloves to check for frostbite. His fingers were indeed icy cold, but the skin looked healthy. "Come in. Let me warm these up." She led him to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. Steam rose from the surface. She'd kept the water from freezing by bringing the pitcher close to her small heating stove during the night. "This might sting a bit," she warned, guiding his hands into the warm water. Calder hissed softly as sensation returned to his fingers, but he didn't pull away. Standing this close, Evelyn became acutely aware of everything about him. The way his hair curled slightly when damp, the careful way he held himself to avoid crowding her, the clean scent of snow and honest work that clung to his clothes. "Better?" she asked after a few minutes. "Much. Thank you." But he made no move to withdraw his hands from hers, and she made no move to release them. "Evelyn, yes? This storm's not going to let up any time soon. Could be days before we can dig out properly. You shouldn't be alone up here if something happens." She understood what he was suggesting, and the practical part of her mind agreed completely. But another part, the part that was growing increasingly aware of Calder as more than just a kind friend, felt a flutter of something that might have been panic. "I'll be fine," she started to say, but the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press her hand to her side. "What's wrong?" Calder's concern was immediate and intense. "Nothing serious. The baby's just very active today. Sometimes it feels like there's a little horse in there trying to kick its way out." To her surprise, Calder smiled. "My mother always said I was the same way. Drove her to distraction with all my rolling around. She claimed I was practicing to be a rodeo rider before I was even born." "Were you?" The question came out more intimate than she'd intended, but the storm seemed to have created a bubble of privacy that invited such confidences. "Never made it to a proper rodeo, but I could stick on just about any horse by the time I was 12. His expression grew thoughtful. "She used to say she could tell what kind of person I'd be just by how I moved before I was born. Strong-willed, but not mean-spirited, energetic, but not destructive." "What do you think this one will be like?" she found herself asking, her hand still resting on her belly. Calder's gaze followed her gesture, and for a moment his expression grew so tender it took her breath away. "If they're anything like their mother, they'll be strong enough to weather any storm, but gentle enough to trust when trust is earned." The compliment hit her unexpectedly deep, especially coming from someone who'd seen her at her most vulnerable. Before she could respond, another strong movement from the baby made her wince slightly. "Here," Calder said, his voice suddenly shy. "My mother used to say there was a way to calm a restless baby before they were born. May I?" She nodded, not entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Calder moved behind her, his hands hovering near her shoulders for a moment, before settling gently on either side of her neck. His touch was warm and careful, thumbs finding the tense muscles at the base of her skull. "She said babies could feel their mother's tension," he explained quietly, beginning to massage with gentle pressure. "If you could help the mother relax, the baby would settle too." The relief was immediate and profound. Evelyn hadn't realized how much tension she'd been carrying until it began to melt away under Calder's careful ministrations. The baby's restless movements gradually quieted as she relaxed into his touch. "That's wonderful," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "Where did your mother learn something like that?" "From her mother, I imagine." "And she from hers?" His voice was soft, intimate in the way of shared secrets. "Some knowledge just gets passed down through the women in a family, one generation to the next." The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. Her own mother had died when Evelyn was barely 15, taking with her all the wisdom about pregnancy and childbirth that should have been passed down. This baby would be born without that inherited knowledge, without the comfort of generations of women who had walked this path before. As if sensing her shift in mood, Calder's hands stilled. "What is it?" "I was just thinking about my mother. About all the things she would have taught me, if she'd lived long enough." The admission came easier than expected, perhaps because his touch had relaxed more than just her physical tension. "Tell me about her," Calder said, his hands resuming their gentle work. "What do you remember?" She had the most beautiful singing voice. She'd hum while she worked, these old songs her grandmother had taught her. "I always thought that when I had children, I'd sing those same songs to them." She paused, realizing she'd never told anyone about this particular grief. "But I can't remember them anymore. The melodies are all mixed up in my head. Maybe they'll come back to you when you need them most," Calder suggested. "Sometimes important things have a way of returning, just when we think they're lost forever." From somewhere in the depths of memory, a fragment of melody stirred, just a few notes, but unmistakably her mother's voice. Evelyn found herself humming softly, the tune emerging as naturally as breathing. "That's beautiful," Calder murmured. "Your baby's going to love hearing you sing." They stood like that for a long time, her humming softly while his hands worked. Magic on the knots of tension she'd been carrying for months. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to fall, but inside their small refuge, warmth and peace reigned. When Calder finally stepped back, the absence of his touch left her feeling oddly bereft. She turned to face him, struck by the expression in his eyes, tender, protective, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "Evelyn," he began, then stopped himself, seeming to wrestle with words he wasn't sure he should speak. "What is it?" "Nothing that can't wait." But his eyes said otherwise, and she found herself stepping closer instead of moving away, colder. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibilities neither had dared acknowledge before. Then the baby moved again, a gentle reminder of the complexities that lay between them, and Calder stepped back with visible effort. "I should let you rest," he said, though his voice suggested that rest was the last thing on either of their minds. "Storm like this, we'll likely be snowed in for a few days. I'll bring meals up, make sure you have everything you need." After he left, Evelyn remained standing where he'd touched her, one hand pressed to her neck where the warmth of his fingers still lingered. In the drawer of her small table, Thomas's watch continued its steady ticking, marking time that seemed to be leading her inexorably toward choices she wasn't sure she was ready to make. But for the first time since Thomas died, the prospect of choosing didn't fill her with panic. Instead, as she settled into her chair with his mother's melody still humming softly in her throat, she felt something that might have been anticipation stirring alongside the new life growing within her. The storm that had begun as a gentle snowfall transformed into something altogether more ferocious by nightfall. Wind howled around the stable with a voice that seemed almost alive, rattling the windows and sending drafts through cracks Evelyn had never noticed before. Her small heating stove, adequate for normal winter nights, struggled against the brutal cold seeping through every surface. She'd wrapped herself in both her own shawl and the community quilt, but still found herself shivering as she tried to read by the flickering light of her oil lamp. The flame wavered with each gust of wind, creating dancing shadows that made the familiar room feel strange and uncertain. A sharp crack from somewhere above made her look up in alarm. Ice, she realized, weighing down the roof beyond what the old timbers were meant to bear. Another crack followed, then a low groaning sound that suggested the very structure of the building was under stress. "Evelyn!" Calder's voice came from below, raised to carry over the wind. "I'm coming up!" She heard his boots on the stairs, heavier than usual, and when he appeared in her doorway, she understood why. He carried an armload of additional blankets, a larger lantern, and what appeared to be emergency supplies. "How bad is it?" she asked, though his grim expression already provided part of the answer. "Bad enough that I don't think you should be alone up here tonight." He set down his burden and moved to examine the ceiling, running his hands along the beams. "These timbers are sound, but that roof's taking more weight than it was built for. If something gives way—" He didn't need to finish the thought. A pregnant woman trapped under collapsed timber and snow would be in mortal danger, and they both knew it. "What do you suggest?" She tried to keep her voice steady, though the baby's sudden, restless movement suggested it sensed her anxiety. "There's a storage room off the main stable. Used to be the tack room before I built the new one. It's got a stone foundation, heavy, beams built to last. I've already moved some blankets down there, started a fire in the old brazier." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's not fancy, but it's safe and warm. The alternative, staying here and risking injury or worse if the roof failed, wasn't really an alternative at all. Yet the thought of spending the night in close quarters with Calder, especially after the intimacy of the afternoon, sent a flutter of nervousness through her chest. "All right," she said, gathering her courage along with her few essential belongings. "Lead the way." The main stable felt like a cavern carved from wind and darkness. Calder's lantern created a small circle of light that seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast shadows surrounding them. The horses stamped and whickered nervously in their stalls, clearly unsettled by the storm's intensity. The storage room Calder had prepared was indeed humble, little more than a large closet with stone walls and a low ceiling, but he'd transformed it into something approaching cozy, Blankets covered the floor in thick layers, creating a makeshift bed large enough for two people to share while maintaining propriety. A small brazier glowed in one corner, its warmth already making the space considerably more comfortable than her room above. "I'll take the floor by the door," Calder said quickly, as if reading her thoughts. "You can have the back area, more protected from drafts." But even as he spoke, another tremendous crack sounded from above, followed by what sounded like part of the roof shifting. The horses whinnied in alarm, and Calder moved swiftly to calm them, his voice low and soothing in the darkness. "Easy. Girls, just a little wind. Nothing we can't weather together." Evelyn settled onto the makeshift bed, pulling the community quilt around her shoulders. The baby had grown increasingly active as the evening progressed, responding to her stress with what felt like an entire dance recital performed against her ribs. "Restless tonight?" Calder asked, returning from his rounds of the horses. "Very. I think all this wind and noise has them stirred up." She pressed her hand to her side, where a particularly vigorous kick had landed. "Sometimes I wonder if they're going to be born ready to run a foot race." Calder smiled, settling onto his own pile of blankets near the door. The space was small, enough that they were only a few feet apart, close enough that she could see the concern he was trying to hide behind his calm demeanor. "My mother used to say that active babies were strong babies," he offered, "said they were just practicing for all the adventures they'd have once they got here." Another gust of wind shook the entire building, and this time the sound from above was definitely something giving way. Calder was on his feet instantly, moving to the door to listen. "That was part of the roof over the hayloft," he said grimly. "Good thing we moved down here when we did." The reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were effectively trapped here until the storm passed, however long that might take. In this small space, with only each other for company and comfort, maintaining the careful distance they'd preserved over the past months would be nearly impossible. As if responding to her thoughts, the brazier flickered, sending shadows dancing across the stone walls. The oil lamp Calder had brought provided steady light, but there was something hypnotic about the way its flame never wavered, a constant point of brightness in the midst of chaos. "That lamp," she said, grateful for something neutral to focus on. "It's beautiful, much nicer than the ones I've seen in town." Calder glanced at the lamp, then back at her. "It was my mother's, one of the few things I kept when I sold the family farm. She always kept it burning in the window when my father was working late, said it would guide him home no matter how. Dark the night got, and now it's guiding us through this storm." The words came out more meaningful than she'd intended, but Calder's expression suggested he understood the deeper significance. "She would have liked that," he said softly. "She always believed that good things were meant to be shared, especially during difficult times." The baby delivered another strong kick, this one accompanied by what felt like a rolling motion that took Evelyn's breath away. She couldn't suppress a small gasp of discomfort. "What can I do?" Calder asked immediately, moving closer without thinking. "I don't know. It's like they've decided tonight is the perfect time for gymnastics." She tried to laugh, but another wave of movement made her press both hands to her belly. "May I?" Calder gestured toward her, and she nodded, understanding what he was asking. He moved to sit beside her on the blankets, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Carefully, respectfully, he placed his hands over hers, on her belly. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, his voice taking on the same gentle tone he used with nervous horses. "Your mama needs to rest, and all this moving around isn't helping anybody." To Evelyn's amazement, the baby seemed to respond to his voice, the frantic movements gradually settling into something more like gentle rolling. Whether it was his words, his touch, or simply coincidence, she felt grateful enough to lean against his shoulder without thinking about the propriety of the gesture. "How did you do that?" she whispered. "Practice with colicky horses," he said with a quiet chuckle. "Amazing how many of the same techniques work on all kinds of restless creatures." They sat like that as the storm raged outside, his arms eventually coming around her in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. The baby continued to move, but gently now, as if settling in for sleep. The oil lamp burned steady and bright, and the brazier cast dancing patterns of warmth across the stone walls. "Calder?" she said eventually, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Yes, thank you for all of this, for keeping us safe." His arms tightened slightly around her, and she felt him press his cheek briefly against the top of her head. "Always," he murmured, and something in the way he said it suggested the promise extended far beyond this single stormy night. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside their small refuge, with the steady flame to guide them and each other's warmth, to sustain them, the storm felt like something they could weather together. Whatever morning might bring, whatever choices lay ahead, tonight they were simply two people keeping each other safe against the darkness, and that felt like enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the postal rider who'd finally managed to break through the snow-blocked trails after nearly a week of isolation. Evelyn recognized the handwriting immediately. Her sister Margaret's careful script, precise and disapproving even at a distance. The envelope bore the postmark of her former hometown, and seeing it felt like watching a ghost materialize in broad daylight. She carried the letter upstairs to her room without opening it, her hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. For 3 days, it sat on her small table beside Thomas's watch, both artifacts from a past she'd thought safely buried beneath miles of snow and silence. Calder noticed her change in mood immediately. Since the night they'd weathered the storm, together something had shifted between them. Barriers had lowered, intimacies had been acknowledged, possibilities had been glimpsed. But now she found herself withdrawing again, struggling to meet his eyes during their morning coffee ritual, answering his gentle questions with monosyllables. "Everything all right?" he asked on the third morning, settling beside her on the upturned crate that had become their customary seat. "You seem distant." "I'm fine." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw him flinch slightly at her tone. "Just tired. The baby's been keeping me awake." It wasn't entirely untrue. The baby had indeed grown more active as she'd entered her 7th month, making comfortable sleep increasingly elusive. But the real source of her sleeplessness was the unopened letter that seemed to pulse with accusation from across the room. Maybe Dr. Matthews should take another. "Look," Calder suggested, his concern evident. "Make sure everything's progressing normally." "I said I'm fine." This time the sharpness was deliberate, designed to push him away before he could get too close to whatever was troubling her. "I don't need you hovering over me like I'm some helpless creature." Calder set down his coffee cup, carefully, his expression closing off in a way she'd never seen before. "I wasn't hovering, I was caring. There's a difference." The quiet dignity in his voice made her chest tight with regret, but she couldn't seem to stop herself from building. "Walls? Well, I don't need your care. I've managed just fine on my own this long." "Yes, you have." He stood slowly, gathering his gloves from where he'd set them on the ground. "I'll remember that." As he walked away, his boots crunching through the snow toward the cattle pastures, Evelyn felt something tear inside her chest. She'd hurt him deliberately, pushed away the one person who'd shown her genuine kindness. And for what? Because a letter from her past had reminded her that happiness was dangerous, that caring about someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. That evening, she finally opened Margaret's letter. "Dearest Evelyn," it began, though the endearment felt cold rather than affectionate. "I hope this finds you well, though I confess I'm writing more in disappointment than sisterly concern." The rest of the letter was exactly what Evelyn had feared, a litany of reproaches disguised as worry. Margaret had discovered where she'd gone, had made inquiries about her circumstances. The tone suggested deep disapproval of Evelyn's choices, thinly veiled behind concern for propriety and family reputation. People are talking naturally. A pregnant widow disappearing without word, only to surface in some frontier town living in questionable circumstances with an unmarried man. Surely you must see how this appears to those who knew you and Thomas. I've done my best to defend your actions, but my patience grows thin. The Hart family has been asking questions as well. Thomas's brother seems to believe he has some claim to the child you carry, being blood family and all. I've told him I know nothing of your whereabouts, but I cannot continue to lie indefinitely. I implore you to consider returning home before you've compromised yourself beyond redemption. There are ways to handle these situations with dignity, but only if you act quickly. A widow in your condition needs family support, not whatever temporary arrangement you've convinced yourself will suffice. The letter was signed with Margaret's full name rather than any affectionate closing, as if she were writing to a stranger. Rather than her only sister, Evelyn read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Thomas's watch. Her sister's words echoed accusations she'd been trying to silence in her own mind for weeks. Was she compromising herself, living in sin, as Margaret's careful phrasing implied? What kind of life was she building for her child in this isolated place, dependent on the charity of a man who owed her nothing? And Thomas's brother, she'd barely thought of Robert Hart since fleeing east. He'd been civil enough at the funeral, but there had been something in his manner that made her uncomfortable. The idea that he might have designs on her child sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter weather. For the next several days, she found herself watching Calder with new eyes, seeing his kindness through the lens of Margaret's suspicions. Was his concern truly selfless, or was he expecting something in return? When he brought her meals or helped with heavy tasks, was he simply being neighborly, or was there calculation behind his gentleness? The questions poisoned everything, making her second-guess every interaction, every moment of growing closeness. When he offered to help her down from Mrs. Patterson's porch after dinner, she declined more sharply than necessary. When he suggested they take a walk to help settle the baby's restless movements, she found excuses to stay indoors. Calder bore her withdrawal with the same patient dignity he showed his horses, but she could see the hurt accumulating in his eyes. The way he began to hold himself more carefully around her, as if she were a skittish animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when she found him mending a bridle in the stable's main aisle. The sight of his hands working the leather with such care, the same hands that had soothed her fears during the storm, that had gentled her baby's restless movements, suddenly felt like an accusation. "You don't have to keep pretending," she said abruptly, standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Calder looked up, genuine confusion replacing the careful neutrality he'd worn lately. "Pretending what? That this arrangement isn't complicated, that people won't talk, that I'm not a burden you've taken on out of misplaced chivalry." The words tumbled out faster than she could stop them, months of guilt and fear finally finding voice. "Evelyn." He set down the bridle and moved toward her, but she stepped back, maintaining distance. "No, let me say this. I know what it looks like. A pregnant widow living in your stable, eating at your table, depending on your generosity. I know what people must think, what they're probably saying. Do you care what people think?" His voice was quieter now, but there was steel underneath the gentleness. "I have to care. I have a child to think about, a reputation to consider. I can't just ignore the consequences of—" She gestured helplessly between them. "Of what? Of friendship? Of two people finding comfort in each other's company during difficult times?" His eyes had gone hard in a way she'd never seen before. "Or are you worried about something else entirely?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, because that was exactly what she was worried about, not just what others might think, but what she herself was beginning to feel. The way her pulse quickened when he smiled at her, the way she'd begun to imagine a future that included more than just survival. "I don't know," she whispered, the honesty of it surprising them both. "Well, when you figure it out," Calder said. picking up the bridle again. "You know where to find me. Until then, I'll try to keep my misplaced chivalry to myself." That night, Evelyn sat by her window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, Margaret's letter open in her lap. In the distance, she could see light in Calder's house, warm and welcoming as always, but the space between her window and his. Her daughter felt vast now, filled with all the words she'd spoken in fear and all the ones she'd left unsaid. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing her turmoil, and she pressed her hands to her belly in the way Calder had taught her. But tonight, her touch brought no comfort, no settling of the restless movements that seemed to echo the chaos in her own heart. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would find a way to apologize, to explain the fear that had driven her to push him away. Tomorrow, she would be brave enough to choose trust over suspicion, hope over the safety of isolation. But as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, Margaret's warnings echoed in her mind like prophecy, and morning felt very far away indeed. Breaking point came on a grey January morning when Evelyn found herself standing in the stable's main aisle, Margaret's letter clutched in one trembling hand and Thomas's pocket watch in the other. The weight of carrying secrets had grown unbearable, pressing against her chest like a stone she could no longer lift alone. Calder was grooming his mare in the far stall, the steady rhythm of the brush against the horse's coat the only sound in the building. He'd been painfully polite over the past week, careful to maintain proper distance while still fulfilling his basic obligations to her welfare. The easy warmth between them had frozen into something brittle and formal, and Evelyn found herself mourning its loss more acutely than she'd expected. "Calder," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the space between them. He looked up, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Yes, I need to tell you something. About Thomas. About why I really left." The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but she couldn't carry the weight of deception any longer. Something in her tone made him set down the brush and give her his full attention. "All right." She moved closer, stopping at the edge of his stall, but maintaining enough distance that she could retreat if courage failed her. The watch felt warm in her palm, as if it still carried the heat of Thomas's body, the memory of the man who'd loved her completely for 3 precious months. "You think Thomas died in an accident?" she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Everyone thinks that. The railroad company called it a boiler explosion. Equipment failure, no one's fault." Calder's expression grew more serious, but he waited patiently for her to continue. "It wasn't an accident." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might lessen their impact. "Thomas died because he tried to save someone else. There was a small child playing near the tracks, too close to the locomotive. Thomas saw what was going to happen and ran to push the child to safety." She paused, gathering strength for the hardest part. "The boiler didn't explode until after Thomas was already on the tracks. He could have saved himself, could have let someone else deal with the situation. But that wasn't who he was." Calder's expression had grown very still, but not with judgment, with the kind of careful attention he gave to injured animals, as if he understood that any sudden movement might cause her to bolt. "The railroad company couldn't admit that one of their locomotives nearly killed a child due to poor safety protocols," she continued. "So they called it an equipment failure, paid out settlements to the families, and buried the truth along with the men who died." "But you knew the truth," Calder said quietly. "I was there." The admission came out as barely a whisper. "I'd come to meet Thomas for lunch, and I saw it all happen. I watched him make the choice to save that child. Watched him—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Calder's understanding expression suggested she didn't need to. "Jesus, Evelyn." The words carried profound compassion rather than pity. "That's a hell of a thing to carry alone." "It gets worse." She forced herself to meet his eyes. The child he saved was the son of one of the town's most prominent families. They knew what Thomas had done, knew he'd saved their boy's life. But when the railroad company offered them money to stay quiet about the real circumstances, they took it. Calder's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained gentle. "And left you to grieve a hero they were calling a victim of bad luck. They couldn't acknowledge what Thomas had done without admitting their own child had been in danger due to their negligence, so they let everyone believe he'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The bitterness that had been festering for months finally found voice. At the funeral, people whispered about what bad luck it was, what a random tragedy. No one spoke about his courage, his selflessness. He died a hero and was buried as just another unfortunate accident. She opened her palm, revealing Thomas's watch. This was the only thing that came back intact. The railroad investigator gave it to me along with their official story about equipment failure. When I tried to tell people what really happened, they said grief was making me imagine things, said I was trying to make his death seem more meaningful than it was. That's why you left, Calder said, understanding flooding his voice. Not just because of grief, but because no one would honor his memory properly. That and, she hesitated, then decided to trust him with the rest of it. The gossip about our marriage, about how quickly I was showing. People started suggesting that maybe Thomas only married me out of obligation, that maybe his death was somehow fitting punishment for... She couldn't finish the ugly implication. For what? For being human? For falling in love and acting on it? Calder's voice carried the first edge of anger she'd heard from him, but it wasn't directed at her. Evelyn, there's nothing shameful about two people finding each other and choosing not to wait for society's blessing to be together. You don't understand. The words came out more desperately than she'd intended. Where I come from, reputation is everything. A woman who's pregnant before she's properly married, even if she marries quickly after, people remember. They count. Months on their fingers and pass judgment, then they're fools who've forgotten what it's like to be young and in love. Calder stepped out of the stall, moving closer, but stopping just outside her personal space. Tell me something. In those 3 months you had with Thomas, were you happy? Completely. The answer came without hesitation. He was everything I'd ever dreamed of in a husband. Kind, gentle, funny, devoted to me in ways I'd never imagined possible. And he loved you, truly loved you, not just married you out of duty. Yes, her voice broke slightly on the word. He told me every day. He said marrying me was the best decision he'd ever made, that he'd been waiting his whole life to find someone who made him feel complete. Then what does it matter what anyone else thinks about the timing? Calder's voice was fierce with conviction. You had 3 months of the kind of love most people never find in a lifetime. The fact that it ended tragically doesn't diminish its value. Tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over, but everyone made it seem so tawdry, like our marriage was some kind of mistake, some desperate attempt to cover up impropriety. Their opinion doesn't change what you know to be true. Calder reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and gently took the watch from her trembling hands. Thomas loved you enough to marry you, loved you enough to die. Saving an innocent child, that's the man your baby will learn about, regardless of what small-minded people choose to whisper. He studied the watch for a moment, noting the inscription on the back, to Thomas, with love and pride, your father. When he handed it back to her, his expression was solemn. This belongs to your child now, he said simply, along with the truth about their father's courage and the love that brought them into being. Anyone who can't see the honor in that story isn't worth your concern. The simple acceptance in his voice, the way he'd received her deepest shame and transformed it back into something worthy of pride, broke something loose in Evelyn's chest. She found herself crying in earnest now, not the careful, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in private, but great gasping sobs that seemed to release months of accumulated grief and fear. Without hesitation, Calder opened his arms, and she fell into them gratefully. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, the other rubbing gentle circles on her back. He didn't try to shush her or hurry her toward comfort. He simply held steady while the storm passed through her. I was so afraid, she whispered against his shoulder when the worst of it had passed. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me the way they did, as someone shameful, someone who brought her troubles on herself. The only thing I see, Calder said quietly, is a woman who loved her husband enough to carry his child with pride, and who was brave enough to leave. Everything familiar, rather than let small-minded people diminish that love. He pulled back slightly to look at her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the remaining tears. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, Evelyn. The truth about Thomas, the worry about your child's future, the fear about what people might think, none of it has to be yours to bear by yourself. You say that now, she said, still fragile from the revelation. But when people start talking, when they start making assumptions about us, let them talk. His voice was calm, certain. I know who you are, and I know who I am, what we choose to build together. Whether it's friendship or something more, that's between us and no one else. The baby chose that moment to move, a gentle, rolling motion that reminded them both of the new life that would soon make all these questions more urgent. Calder's gaze dropped to her belly, and she saw something that might have been wonder cross his features. Your child is going to know their father was a hero, he said firmly, and they're going to grow up in a place where that kind of courage is honored, not hidden. I'll make sure of that. Standing there in the warm stable, with honest tears still drying on her cheeks and Thomas's watch heavy in her palm, Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp crack of breaking, but the slow, steady movement of ice beginning to thaw. For the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her child might indeed grow up knowing the truth about their father's heroism, surrounded by people who understood that love, in all its forms, was worth celebrating, rather than condemning. 3 days after Evelyn's revelation about Thomas, she found Calder standing motionless in his pasture, staring at something she couldn't see. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the snow, and there was something in his posture, a stillness that spoke of old pain rather than peaceful contemplation, that made her approach with careful steps. Calder, she called softly when she reached the fence line. He turned, and she was struck by the haunted expression in his eyes, as if her honesty about Thomas had stirred up ghosts he'd thought safely buried. In his hands, he held a folded paper that looked official, formal in the way of government documents. I think it's my turn, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before, to tell you who I really am. They walked back to the stable in silence, settling in the warm tack room where they'd weathered the storm together. Calder smoothed the paper on his knee, and Evelyn could see it was some kind of military document, stamped and signed with the gravity of official business. You asked me once why I came to Willow Creek, why I chose ranching over farming like my family always had. He traced the edge of the paper with one finger. I told you part of the truth, that I lost Sarah while I was away. But I never told you where I was, or why I stayed away so long. Evelyn waited, understanding that this confession would come at its own pace, in its own way. This is my discharge paper from the army, he continued, holding up the document, signed by my commanding officer after 4 years of service in what they called the Indian Wars. 4 years of doing things that still wake me up some nights, wondering who I used to be before I learned to kill for my country. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because she judged him for his service, but because she recognized the self-condemnation in his voice, the way shame could twist a person's understanding of their own worth. I enlisted when I was 19, Calder continued, his gaze fixed on something beyond the stable walls. Thought I was going to be a hero, fighting for civilization and progress. The recruiting officer made it sound like we'd be protecting settlers from savage attacks, bringing peace to the frontier. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It didn't take long to learn that heroes and villains aren't as easy to tell apart as the newspapers make them seem. Most of what we did, most of the people we fought, They were just trying to protect their families, their way of life, same as we were. Evelyn thought of Thomas dying to save a child, and felt a stab of recognition. War, it seemed, had a way of forcing good men into impossible choices. There was one night, Calder said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, in Montana territory. We'd been tracking a band of Lakota who'd raided a supply train. Caught up with them at their winter camp. He stopped, and Evelyn could see him wrestling with memories that clearly still had the power to devastate him. They had children with them, women, old people. It wasn't a war party. It was families trying to survive winter with whatever supplies they could find. But our orders were clear. No survivors, no exceptions. Oh, Calder! The words escaped before she could stop them, carrying all the compassion she felt for the young man he'd been, forced into a situation no one should have to face. I couldn't do it. He looked at her directly for the first time since beginning. His story. When the shooting started, I found myself aiming high, missing on purpose. Saved who I could, when I could, without making it obvious what I was doing. That took tremendous courage. Did it? Or was I just a coward who couldn't follow orders? The question seemed to torment him still. 3 of my fellow soldiers died. That night because the fighting went on longer than it should have, because some of us hesitated when we should have acted. Evelyn reached for his hands, stilling the restless movement of his fingers against the discharge paper. You tried to protect innocent people. That's not cowardice, that's conscience. Tell that to the families of the men who died because I couldn't be the soldier they needed me to be. But his hands didn't pull away from hers, and she sensed he was sharing a burden he'd carried alone for too long. Is that why you blame yourself for Sarah's death too? Because you think you don't deserve happiness after what happened? Calder's intake of breath told her she'd hit close to the mark. I was supposed to come home after 2 years. Sarah had been waiting, planning our wedding, building a life for us to share. But I kept re-enlisting, kept finding reasons to stay. Away. Because you felt guilty about surviving when others didn't. Because I didn't know how to come home and pretend to be the same man who'd left. He pulled his hands free, but gently, without rejection. How could I marry Sarah, start a family, build a peaceful life when I'd done things? Seen things? That changed everything I thought I knew about right and wrong. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, thinking about her own struggles with guilt and unworthiness. What would Sarah have said if you'd told her the truth? That's just it. I'll never know. By the time I finally got the courage to come home, to try to explain what 4 years of war had done to me, she was already dead. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Died thinking I'd abandoned her, that military life meant more to me than our future together. You don't know that's what she thought. I know she died alone, wondering why the man she loved had chosen to stay away when he could have come home to her. The guilt in his voice was so familiar, so much like her own struggles with shame over Thomas's death, that Evelyn felt her heart break for him. So you came here, she said softly, to a place where no one knew your history, where you could try to build something good with the life you had left. I thought if I worked hard enough, helped enough people, maybe I could balance the scales somehow, make up for the things I'd done, the choices I'd made. He gestured around the stable, toward the house where Mrs. Patterson waited with dinner, toward the town beyond. But every time something good starts to happen, every time I think maybe I deserve a chance at happiness, I remember those nights in Montana. I remember Sarah dying alone because I was too much of a coward to come home and face what I'd become. Evelyn understood now why he'd been so careful with her, so reluctant to push for more than friendship despite the obvious connection between them. He didn't think he deserved love, didn't believe he had the right to reach for happiness when others had paid the price for his survival. Calder, she said, choosing her words carefully, what if you're wrong? What if Sarah understood that war changes people, that the man who came back wouldn't be exactly the same as the one who left? What if she would have loved you anyway, would have helped you find your way back to yourself? We'll never know. No, but we know other things. We know you've spent the last 8 years trying to live a life that honors the memory of the people you couldn't save. We know you've built something good here, helped your neighbors, treated everyone with kindness and respect. She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. And we know that the man who saved my life when my wagon broke down, who's cared for me and my unborn child without asking for anything in return, that man deserves to be happy. You say that now, he replied, echoing her own words from days earlier. But knowing what I've done, what I've been part of, changes nothing about who you are today. Her voice carried the same certainty he'd offered her when she'd confessed her fears about Thomas. You're not the frightened young soldier who made impossible choices in an impossible war. You're the man who chose conscience over orders, who's spent years trying to build instead of destroy, who offered shelter to a stranger because it was the right thing to do. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of shared confessions settling between them like snow, heavy, but also somehow cleansing. Outside, the winter afternoon was fading toward evening, and soon Mrs. Patterson would ring the dinner bell that had become such a comforting constant in their daily routine. "Thank you," Calder said finally, carefully folding his discharge papers and tucking them back into his jacket, "for listening, for not judging. Thank you for trusting me with it." Evelyn stood slowly, her increasing bulk making the simple movement more challenging each day. We make quite a pair, don't we? Two people carrying guilt for things that weren't entirely our fault, convinced we don't deserve the happiness that might be right in front of us. Calder stood too, and for a moment they faced each other in the growing twilight. Two souls who had shared their deepest shames and found acceptance instead of condemnation. "Maybe," he said quietly, "it's time we started believing we deserve better than carrying these burdens alone." As they walked toward Mrs. Patterson's kitchen and the warm light spilling from her windows, Evelyn felt something fundamental shift between them. Not the giddy excitement of new attraction, but something deeper, the solid foundation of two people who had seen each other's worst moments and chosen to stay, chosen to build something together, despite the pain they'd each carried for too long. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they might face, she knew they would face them honestly, with the kind of trust that only comes from having nothing left to hide. February arrived with a deceptive gentleness, bringing warmer days that hinted at spring's eventual return. Evelyn had grown large enough that even her loosest dress required strategic arranging to accommodate the baby, and simple tasks like climbing the stairs to her room left her breathless. Dr. Matthews estimated she had perhaps 6 weeks remaining, maybe less if the baby decided to arrive early. It was during one of these increasingly difficult climbs that she discovered Calder's latest project. At the top of the stairs, positioned carefully in the corner where morning light would reach it best, sat the most beautiful wooden cradle she'd ever seen. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Smooth, curved rockers, intricate patterns carved into the headboard, and sides high enough to keep a restless baby safe, but low enough for a tired mother to reach in easily. The wood had been polished to a warm, honey color that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through her window. "Calder," she called down the stairs, her voice thick with unexpected emotion. His boots sounded on the wooden steps, and he appeared in her doorway looking almost shy, his hat in his hands like a schoolboy presenting a project to his teacher. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing toward the cradle. "I had some spare wood, and the evenings have been long lately. Seemed like something useful to do with my hands." Evelyn moved closer to examine his work, running her fingers along the smooth edges and marveling at the obvious care that had gone into every detail. "Calder, this is extraordinary. The carving, the finish work. Where did you learn to do something like this?" "My grandfather was a furniture maker back in Pennsylvania. Taught me some basics when I was a boy, before my family moved west. To farm," He stepped closer, pointing out subtle details she might have missed. "See these curves here? They're designed to rock gently with just a small push, but not so much that the baby would be startled awake. And this pattern." She traced the intricate design carved into the headboard, intertwining vines and flowers that seemed to dance across the wood. That's something my grandfather used to carve into pieces meant for new families. Said it represented a growth, new life taking root and flourishing. Colour rose in his cheeks as he spoke. Seemed appropriate. The thoughtfulness behind every element of the cradle's design overwhelmed her. This wasn't just a functional piece of furniture. It was a gift, crafted with love, a tangible symbol of welcome for her unborn child. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, unable to trust her voice to remain steady. "No thanks needed." But his expression suggested her gratitude meant more to him than he was willing to admit. Every baby deserves to be welcomed properly, to have a place that's been made specially for them. She thought of her own childhood, of the simple rope bed she'd shared with Margaret until their mother died, and felt a surge of gratitude for this man who was ensuring her child's entry into the world would be marked by such care and craftsmanship. "There's something else," Calder said, moving to a small cloth bundle she hadn't noticed beside the cradle. "Mrs. Patterson and we thought you might need some other things too." Inside the bundle, she found tiny clothes, obviously sewn by Mrs. Patterson's expert hands. Soft cotton gowns with careful embroidery, warm blankets knitted in pale yellow and green, and delicate booties that would barely fit a doll. But what moved her most was a small wooden rattle, clearly carved by Calder to match the cradle's design. "The ladies in town contributed fabric and notions," Calder explained. "Mrs. Patterson did most of the sewing, though she made sure I understood. These were gifts from the whole community, not charity. How can I ever repay all this kindness? By raising that baby to know they're loved and wanted," he said simply. "By letting them grow up understanding that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, not just the ones we're born to." The baby, as if responding to the conversation about their future, delivered a particularly strong movement that made Evelyn gasp and press her hand to her side. These episodes had been growing more frequent and intense, leaving her breathless, and sometimes a little frightened by the sheer force of life growing within her. "Here," Calder said, immediately moving to help steady her. "Sit down, let me get you some water." "I'm all right," she insisted, but allowed him to guide her to the chair by the window. "It's just, the baby seems to have very strong opinions." "About things lately?" Calder knelt beside her chair, his expression serious. "Dr. Matthews said you should send for him immediately when the real labor starts. I've got a horse saddled and ready at all times now. And Mrs. Patterson knows to keep her medical supplies handy." "You've thought of everything." The realization brought both comfort and a strange sort of melancholy. Soon, very soon, this peaceful interlude would end, and her child would be born into a world full of uncertainties and challenges she couldn't yet foresee. "Evelyn," Calder said quietly, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when approaching skittish horses, "I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide about your future, that baby will always have a place here. A home, people who care about them, a community that wants to see them thrive. And their mother?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, carrying all the vulnerability she'd been trying to hide. "Especially their mother." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "If she wants it, if she thinks a broken-down cowboy with too much history and too little to offer might be worth the risk." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but Evelyn felt her heart respond to the possibility he was offering. Not just security for her child, but something deeper, partnership, companionship, maybe even love. "Calder," she began, but another strong movement from the baby cut off whatever she might have said. "We don't have to decide anything now," he said, standing and moving back to give her space, "but I wanted you to know the choice exists when you're ready to make it." That evening, as she prepared for bed, Evelyn found herself standing beside the beautiful cradle, imagining it filled with her child. The baby's movements had settled into a more regular rhythm, as if they too were preparing for the transition that lay ahead. She thought about Calder's careful words, his offer of a future that included not just survival, but genuine happiness. After months of feeling like she was running from one catastrophe toward another, the possibility of choosing a life rather than simply enduring one felt almost too good to believe. From her window, she could see light in Calder's house, warm and steady as always. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. But tonight, surrounded by gifts crafted with love and care, her child rocking gently in their beautiful new cradle, Evelyn allowed herself to imagine a future where belonging wasn't something she had to earn through suffering, but something she could choose to accept. The baby moved once more, a gentle rolling motion that felt almost like contentment, and Evelyn pressed her hand to her belly. In the gesture that had become second nature, soon, she whispered to the child within, "Soon you'll be here, and we'll figure out together what kind of life we want to build." Outside, snow began to fall again, but softly this time, like a blessing rather than a trial. Spring was still weeks away, but for the first time since Thomas died, Evelyn found herself looking forward to its arrival rather than simply hoping to survive until it came. The contractions began at dawn on a Tuesday in early March, gentle at first, just a tightening across her belly that Evelyn initially mistook for the baby's increasingly vigorous movements. She was hanging laundry behind the stable when the first unmistakable pain seized her, doubling her over the clothesline with its intensity. "Oh!" she gasped, gripping the rope with white knuckles as the sensation rolled through her like a wave. When it passed, leaving her breathless and shaking, she knew with absolute certainty that today was the day. Calder found her there 5 minutes later, having come to help with the heavier items as had become his morning custom. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "How long?" he asked, already moving to support her weight as another contraction began to build. "Just started," she managed between breaths. "But they're already quite strong." He helped her into the house where Mrs. Patterson took one look at the situation and immediately shifted into the crisp efficiency of someone who'd assisted at dozens of births over her lifetime. "Calder, fetch Dr. Matthews immediately," she commanded, already bustling around gathering supplies. "And bring back Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Morrison too. We'll need all hands for this one." "Don't leave," Evelyn pleaded as another contraction gripped her, stronger than the last. The speed with which they were intensifying frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "I'll be back before you know it," Calder promised, but she could see the worry in his eyes as he pressed a quick kiss to her forehead. "Mrs. Patterson will take good care of you." The next few hours passed in a blur of increasing pain and gathering helpers. Dr. Matthews arrived with his medical bag and calm, professional demeanor, examining her quickly before pronouncing that the baby was indeed ready to make its entrance into the world. "First babies usually take their time," he said, washing his hands in the basin Mrs. Patterson had prepared. "But this little one seems to be in quite a hurry." Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Morrison arrived together, bringing additional clean linens and the kind of practical experience that came from having raised multiple children of their own. They worked around Evelyn with quiet competence, creating an atmosphere of capable support that helped ease her mounting anxiety. Calder returned from his errands to find the house transformed into something resembling a medical facility. He hovered at the edge of the activity, clearly wanting to help but uncertain of his place in this particularly feminine domain. "Stay," Evelyn called to him during a brief respite between contractions. "Please, I need you here." Dr. Matthews looked up from his preparations, taking in Calder's obvious devotion and Evelyn's clear need for his presence. "If the lady wants you here, then here is where you belong. Just follow Mrs. Patterson's lead and do what you're told." As the labor progressed, Calder proved himself invaluable in ways none of them had expected. His years of experience with difficult birthing among his cattle had given him an intuitive understanding of the process, and his naturally calm demeanor helped steady Evelyn when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. "Breathe with me," he murmured. During the worst contractions, his hands supporting her as she leaned into his strength. "Just like we practiced with the horses, remember? Deep and steady, let the pain flow through you instead of fighting against it." The technique worked better than any of the traditional remedies the other women suggested. Evelyn found herself focusing on Calder's voice, his steady presence, the warmth of his hands, as he helped her through each wave of intensity. "You're doing beautifully," Mrs. Patterson murmured, checking her progress. "Won't be much longer now." But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that something wasn't progressing as it should. The baby seemed to be in an unusual position, making the final stage of labor more difficult than anyone had anticipated. "Dr. Matthews?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a note of concern that made everyone in the room tense. The doctor moved, too. Examine Evelyn more thoroughly, his expression growing serious. "The baby's turned sideways," he explained quietly. "We're going to need to help them along." What followed was the most frightening experience of Evelyn's life. Dr. Matthews worked with careful precision, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he attempted to guide the baby into the proper position for birth. Calder never left her side, letting her grip his hands with crushing force as she fought through contractions that seemed to go on forever. "I can't," she gasped at one point, exhaustion threatening to drag her under. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," Calder said fiercely, his face close to hers so she could see the absolute conviction in his eyes. "You're the strongest person I know, Evelyn Hart. This baby is going to be here soon, and they're going to be perfect, and you're going to be an amazing mother." "I see the head," Dr. Matthews announced suddenly, his voice carrying the first note of excitement they'd heard from him all day. "Come on, Evelyn, one more big push, and we'll have ourselves a baby." With strength she didn't know she possessed, Evelyn bore down with everything she had left. The room filled with the sound of her effort, the encouraging voices of the women who'd rallied around her, and Calder's steady murmur of support. And then, suddenly, the pain was over, and the room was filled with a completely different sound, the indignant wail of a newborn baby announcing their arrival to the world. "It's a girl," Dr. Matthews declared, holding up a tiny, perfect creature covered in blood and birth fluids, but undeniably beautiful. A healthy, strong little girl. Evelyn collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as she watched the doctor clean her daughter and wrap her in one of the soft blankets Mrs. Patterson had prepared. The baby's cries were strong and clear, the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "She's perfect," Calder whispered, his own voice thick with emotion as Dr. Matthews placed the baby in Evelyn's arms. "Look at her, Evelyn. Look what you did." The baby was indeed perfect, tiny but strong, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with alert intelligence. When Evelyn spoke to her for the first time, the crying stopped immediately, as if she recognized the voice she'd been hearing for months. "Hello, little one," Evelyn murmured, studying every detail of her daughter's face. "I'm your mama, and I've been waiting so long to meet you." Calder reached out carefully, stroking one finger along the baby's cheek with the same gentle touch he used with newborn foals. "She's beautiful, Evelyn, absolutely beautiful." "She needs a name," Mrs. Patterson said practically, but her voice was soft with the wonder that always accompanied new life. Evelyn looked down at her daughter, then up at Calder, whose expression held such tenderness that it took her breath away. She thought of Thomas, who would never see this perfect child, and felt a moment of profound sadness. But then she looked around the room at the people who had helped bring her daughter safely into the world, and felt gratitude overwhelm. "The grief, Hope," she said quietly. "Her name is Hope." Dr. Matthews nodded approvingly as he cleaned up his instruments. "Hope Hart. A fine name for a little girl born into such a loving community. As the other women bustled around cleaning up and preparing a proper meal for the new mother, Calder remained beside the bed, his attention completely focused on Evelyn and the baby in her arms. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly, shifting Hope so Calder could see her better, "for everything, for being here, for helping me through it, for making sure she was born into a world full of people who already love her." "Thank you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for letting me be part of it, for trusting me to be here for the most important moment of her life." Hope chose that moment to open her eyes, fixing her gaze on Calder's face with the intense attention that newborns sometimes display. For a long moment, the three of them existed in a bubble of perfect peace, connected by something deeper than blood or law, by choice, by love, by the simple miracle of new life, beginning in a place where it would be cherished and protected. Outside, the March wind was blowing away the last of winter's snow, clearing the ground for spring's return. Inside, Hope Hart slept peacefully in her mother's arms, surrounded by the community that had welcomed her before she was even born, watched over by the man who had already claimed her as his own in all the ways that mattered most. The first week of Hope's life passed in a haze of wonder and exhaustion. Evelyn had read about the challenges of new motherhood, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of caring for such a tiny, dependent creature whose needs seemed to change from moment to moment. Hope was a good baby, as Mrs. Patterson repeatedly assured her, but she was also demanding in the way of all newborns. She fed frequently, slept in unpredictable patterns, and required constant attention to her basic needs. Without the support network that had rallied around them, Evelyn wasn't sure how she would have managed. Calder proved to be an unexpected source of help. His experience with newborn animals translated surprisingly well to human babies, and he seemed to have an intuitive understanding of Hope's needs that sometimes surpassed even Evelyn's. "She's fussing because she's too warm," he observed one afternoon, watching Hope's restless movements in her beautiful wooden cradle. "See how she's pushing the blanket away? She wants to cool down a bit." He was right, as he usually was about such things. Once they'd adjusted her coverings, Hope settled immediately into peaceful sleep. "How do you always know?" Evelyn asked, settling into the chair beside the cradle to watch her daughter's tiny chest rise and fall. "Same signs the animals give when something's not quite right," Calder explained, his voice soft to avoid waking the baby. "Little movements, changes in breathing, the way they hold themselves. You learn to read the signals when you can't rely on words." It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Evelyn began to see the depth of Calder's attachment to Hope. He would spend long minutes simply watching her sleep, his expression soft with wonder at the miracle of new life. When she was awake, he talked to her in the same gentle tone he used with his horses, telling her stories about the ranch, about the town, about all the people who were already looking forward to watching her grow. "She's going to be a heartbreaker," Mrs. Patterson declared during one of her daily visits. "Look at those eyes, how alert she is already. This one's going to be smart as a whip and twice as determined." Hope did indeed seem unusually aware of her surroundings for such a young baby. Her dark eyes, so much like Thomas's, would focus intently on faces, following movement with an intelligence that suggested she was already trying to make sense of the world around her. "She knows you," Evelyn observed one evening, watching Calder hold Hope while she prepared for bed. The baby was completely relaxed in his arms, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. "I've been talking to her since before she was born," he admitted, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Whenever I was working around the stable and you were resting upstairs, I'd tell her about her day, about what was happening outside. Figured she might as well get used to my voice." The image of Calder carrying on one-sided conversations with her unborn child touched Evelyn more deeply than she'd expected. It spoke to a tenderness, a capacity for love that some men never developed. even for their own biological children. Calder, she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision the moment seemed to require. I want you to know how grateful I am. Not just for the help, but for the way you love her. The way you've claimed her as yours. She is mine, he said simply, his gaze never leaving Hope's sleeping face. Maybe not by blood, but in every other way that matters. I was here when she took her first breath. I helped bring her safely into the world, and I plan to be here for every important moment that follows. The certainty in his voice, the quiet conviction that family was something you built rather than something you were simply born into, made Evelyn's chest tight with emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. That night, as she nursed Hope in the quiet darkness of her room, Evelyn found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't dared before. For months, she'd been focused simply on survival, getting through each day, preparing for the baby's birth, finding a safe place to raise her child. But now, watching Hope's tiny fingers curl around her thumb, she began to imagine something more. She thought about Hope's first steps, her first words, her first day of school. She imagined teaching her to read, to sew, to tend a garden. She pictured birthdays and holidays, scraped knees that would need kissing, bedtime stories that would need telling, and in every imagined scene, Calder was there, not as a helpful neighbor or a charitable friend, but as something more fundamental, as Hope's father in every way that mattered, as the man who would teach her to ride horses and stand up for herself, and understand that love was something you chose to give and receive. The realization didn't come as a shock, so much as a quiet acknowledgement of something she'd been moving toward for months. Somewhere between his offer of shelter and his gift of the cradle, between the night they'd weathered the storm together and the moment he'd helped deliver her daughter, Evelyn had fallen in love with Calder Beck, not the desperate, all-consuming passion she'd felt for Thomas, that had been the love of youth, brilliant and intense, but fragile in its very intensity. This was something different, deeper, and more durable. It was built on trust earned through difficulty, on compatibility tested by hardship, on the kind of mutual respect that could weather whatever storms life might bring. The next morning, she woke to find Calder already tending the horses, his movements efficient and purposeful as always. But when he looked up and saw her watching from the window, his smile held a warmth that made her pulse quicken with possibility. "Morning," he called softly, mindful of the sleeping baby in her arms. "How's our girl today?" Our girl. The casual possessiveness of the phrase no longer made her nervous. Instead, it filled her with a contentment she'd thought lost forever when Thomas died. "She's perfect," Evelyn replied, and meant it. Hope was perfect, their makeshift family was perfect, and the future that was slowly taking shape around them felt like something worth choosing rather than simply enduring. Later that day, while Hope napped in her cradle and Calder worked in the barn below, Evelyn took out paper and pen to write a letter she'd been avoiding for weeks. Margaret deserved to know she was an aunt, deserved to understand that her sister had found not just survival, but genuine happiness in this unexpected place. "Dear Margaret," she began, then paused to consider how to explain everything that had changed since she'd fled their hometown in grief and shame. "I write to tell you that you have a niece. Hope Hart was born on March 8th, healthy and strong, and more beautiful than I could have imagined. She has Thomas's eyes, and what I suspect will be his stubborn determination based on her already pronounced opinions about when she wants to eat and sleep. I know you worried about my circumstances here, about the propriety of my situation. I want you to understand that I have found something I never expected, not just safety, but a community that has embraced both Hope and me with genuine love. The man who offered me shelter has become something far more precious than a landlord. or even a friend. He delivered hope with his own hands, and she knows his voice as well as she knows mine. This is not the life I planned when I married Thomas, but it is a good life, full of people who chose to love us rather than judge us. Hope will grow up knowing she is wanted, knowing she belongs, knowing that families can be built through commitment and care rather than simply inherited through blood. I hope someday you might visit and meet your niece. I think you would understand if you could see her here why running away turned out to be the bravest thing I could have done. She signed the letter with more confidence than she'd felt in months, then sealed it carefully. Tomorrow she would. Ask Calder to post it when he went to town for supplies. Tonight she would simply enjoy watching her daughter sleep in the cradle he'd made with his own hands, surrounded by the quiet contentment of knowing she'd finally found her way home. The stranger arrived on a Thursday morning in late March, when the first hints of spring were finally beginning to show in the budding trees around Willow Creek. Evelyn was nursing Hope in the chair by her window when she spotted the unfamiliar buggy making its way down the main street, driven by a man in an expensive coat who looked distinctly out of place among the practical frontier attire of the town's residents. Something about his bearing, the authoritative way he surveyed the buildings as he passed, sent a chill of premonition through her chest. When the buggy turned toward the livery stable, that chill became certainty. "Calder!" she called down the stairs, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "There's someone here to see us." By the time she'd made her way downstairs with Hope in her arms, the stranger had already dismounted and was examining the stable with the calculating gaze of someone making an assessment. He was a thin, sharp-featured man in his 40s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time indoors and the expensive clothing of someone with means. "Mr. Beck, I presume," the stranger said, as Calder emerged from the barn, his voice carrying the clipped authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Robert Hart, attorney at law. I believe you are harboring my deceased brother's widow and her child." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face at the name. Robert Hart, Thomas's older brother, the one who had barely acknowledged her existence during their brief marriage, who had looked at her with barely concealed disapproval at the funeral. She had hoped never to see him again. "Mrs. Hart is a guest here, yes," Calder replied carefully, his voice taking on the neutral tone he used with difficult horses. "What business do you have with her?" "Family business," Robert said crisply, withdrawing a sheaf of legal documents from his coat. "I represent the interests of the Hart family estate, and I'm here to collect my brother's child." "Collect?" The word came out sharper than Evelyn had intended, drawing Robert's attention to where she stood in the stable doorway with Hope pressed protectively against her chest. "Evelyn," Robert's smile was thin and cold. "You look, well, motherhood. He appears to agree with you, despite the unfortunate circumstances of your situation." "What do you want, Robert?" She forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his gaze despite the way her heart was racing with fear. "What's best for the child, naturally." He gestured toward Hope as if she were a piece of property under discussion. "Surely you must realize that raising Thomas's heir in these primitive conditions is hardly what he would have wanted for his offspring." "Hope is perfectly well cared for here," Evelyn said firmly, though she could hear the tremor in her own voice. "Hope?" Robert's eyebrows rose in obvious disapproval. "Such a sentimental name for a Hart. The family has a tradition of naming children after deceased relatives. The proper name for Thomas's daughter would be Caroline, after our grandmother." "Her name is Hope," Calder said quietly, moving to stand beside Evelyn in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Robert. "And you are?" Robert's tone suggested he already knew the answer and disapproved of it. "Calder Beck. I own this ranch." "Ah, yes, the benefactor." Robert's voice dripped with implication. "How convenient for my sister-in-law to find such generous accommodation so far from home. Tell me, Mr. Beck, what exactly do you expect in return for your charity?" The insult hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and deliberate. Evelyn saw Calder's jaw tighten, but his voice remained steady when he responded. I expect nothing except the pleasure of helping a woman in need raise her child in safety and peace. How noble. Robert's smile grew more pronounced. Unfortunately, the courts may take a different view of the arrangement. An unmarried woman living in questionable circumstances with a man to whom she is not related, dependent entirely on his goodwill for her survival, hardly the stable environment a child deserves. He unfolded the legal documents with theatrical precision. These papers grant temporary custody of Thomas Hart's child to the Hart family estate, pending a full investigation into the mother's fitness and circumstances. I'm authorized to take the child immediately. You can't be serious, Evelyn gasped, clutching Hope tighter. She's barely 3 weeks old. She needs her mother. She needs proper care and a respectable upbringing, Robert corrected. My wife has been eager to provide both, along with all the advantages that come with being raised as a true Hart. Education, society connections, financial security, everything this frontier existence could never offer. And what about love? Calder asked quietly. What about being wanted for herself rather than as some kind of family legacy? Love is a luxury, Mr. Beck. Security is a necessity. Robert stepped closer, his hand extending toward Hope. I'll thank you to hand over the child now. My buggy is waiting, and we have a long journey ahead of us. No. The word came out with more force than Evelyn had known she possessed. You are not taking my daughter. I'm afraid I am. Robert's facade of politeness finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. These documents are legally binding. If you refuse to comply, I'll be forced to involve the local sheriff. Then involve him, Calder said, his voice carrying a steel Evelyn had never heard before. Let's see what Sheriff Morrison has to say about a stranger riding into his town with papers from back east, trying to separate a baby from her mother. Robert's confidence wavered slightly at the mention of local law enforcement, but he rallied quickly. The law is quite clear on matters of child welfare. An unmarried woman living in sin, dependent on the charity of men, is hardly a fit guardian for any child, let alone one with heart blood. Living in sin? Mrs. Patterson's voice cut across the confrontation like a whip crack. None of them had noticed her approaching, but she now stood at the edge of the group, with her arms crossed and her expression thunderous. That's a serious accusation to make without proof, Mr. Hart. Behind her stood several other townspeople, who had been drawn by the raised voices, Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Morrison, and Dr. Matthews among them. Their faces showed varying degrees of curiosity and concern, but all held the same protective stance toward Evelyn and Hope. I don't believe we've been introduced, Robert said, clearly unsettled by the sudden appearance of witnesses. Agnes Patterson. I run the boarding house here, and I've been watching over this young woman since she arrived. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through enough foolishness to recognize it immediately. I can attest to her character, her circumstances, and the exemplary care she provides for her child. As can I, Dr. Matthews added, stepping forward. I delivered that baby and have been monitoring both mother and child since birth. Both are in excellent health, and the child is clearly thriving under her mother's care. Robert looked around at the gathering crowd with growing unease. Whatever reception he had expected in this small frontier town, it clearly wasn't this unified wall of support. You people don't understand, he said, his voice rising slightly. I'm offering this child a chance at a real life with real advantages, not this hand-to-mouth existence on the edge of nowhere. What we understand, Sheriff Morrison said, arriving with the calm authority of someone accustomed to handling disputes, is that you're causing a disturbance in my town with some papers nobody here has had a chance to examine. He held out his hand expectantly. Let's have a look at these documents, shall we? See exactly what authority you think you have here. As Robert reluctantly handed over the papers, Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude for the community that had rallied around her. Without hesitation, these people, who had started as strangers, were now standing between her and the loss of everything that mattered most. But even as Sheriff Morrison examined the legal documents with a frown of concentration, she could see the doubt in his eyes. Robert might be an outsider, and his methods might be distasteful, but the law had a way of favoring men with money and connections over women who depended on the kindness of others. Hope stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds that meant she would soon be hungry again. The thought that this might be one of the last times she held her daughter, that Robert might actually have the legal authority to take her away, made Evelyn's vision blur with unshed tears. "We'll fight this," Calder murmured beside her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll fight this." But as Sheriff Morrison's frown deepened while he read the legal papers, Evelyn wondered if fighting would be enough, or if the past she'd tried so hard to escape had finally caught up with her in the cruelest way possible. Sheriff Morrison finished, reading the legal documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that words on paper could change lives forever. The gathered townspeople waited in tense silence, their faces reflecting the same protective concern that had brought them running when they heard raised voices near the stable. "Well," the sheriff said finally, folding the papers with deliberate care, "these documents do appear to be legally filed in your home county, Mr. Hart, but there are a few problems with your assumption that they carry any weight here in Willow Creek." Robert's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "Problems? First, these papers grant you temporary custody pending an investigation into the mother's fitness. But no such investigation has been conducted, nor has the mother been given opportunity to respond to whatever charges might be brought against her character." Sheriff Morrison's voice carried the measured authority of someone who had dealt with enough legal disputes to understand their complexities. "Second, you're operating under the assumption that Mrs. Hart is living in questionable circumstances, but from what I can observe, she's residing in a community that has embraced both her and her child with genuine care and support." "She's an unmarried woman living in a man's household," Robert protested, grasping for his earlier argument. "Surely even frontier justice recognizes the impropriety." "Actually," Mrs. Patterson interrupted with the satisfaction of someone playing a trump card, "Mrs. Hart doesn't live in Mr. Beck's household. She rents the room above his stable, pays her way through work around the ranch, and takes her meals at my boarding house like any other respectable resident of this town." Dr. Matthews nodded his agreement. "I can attest to the propriety of the arrangement. Mrs. Hart maintains her own residence and independence while receiving the community support that any new mother requires. Furthermore," Mrs. Morrison added, stepping forward with a document of her own, "the ladies of Willow Creek have prepared something we think you should see." She unfolded a petition signed by what appeared to be every adult woman in town, along with many of the men. The heading was written in Mrs. Henderson's careful script: "Attestation to the character and fitness of Mrs. Evelyn Hart as mother and community member." "This document," Mrs. Morrison continued, "speaks to Mrs. Hart's character, her devoted care of her child, her contribution to our community, and our unanimous support for her continuing to raise her daughter here among people who know and value both of them." Robert stared at the petition as if it were written in a foreign language. "This is highly irregular. Family court decisions aren't made by popular vote." "No," Sheriff Morrison agreed, "but they are influenced by evidence of a parent's character and circumstances, and this petition provides considerable evidence that Mrs. Hart is not only a fit mother, but a valued member of a stable, supportive community." "There's something else you should know," Calder said quietly, his voice carrying a calm certainty that made everyone turn to look at him. "Mrs. Hart and I are engaged to be married. The ceremony will take place as soon as the proper arrangements can be made. The announcement hit the gathered crowd like a physical shock. Evelyn felt her heart skip several beats as she stared at Calder in amazement. They had never discussed marriage, never spoken of engagement or formal commitment beyond the careful possibilities they'd begun to explore. But when she met his eyes, she saw not manipulation or desperation, but a steady determination to protect what had become most precious to both of them. This wasn't a lie told for convenience, it was a public declaration of intentions they had both been moving toward, but had never quite found the courage to voice. "Is this true?" Sheriff Morrison asked Evelyn directly, giving her the opportunity to contradict Calder's statement if she chose. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Evelyn felt the weight of every gaze in the group. Robert's expression of calculating anger, the hopeful faces of her neighbors, Calder's steady presence beside her, and most importantly, Hope's perfect trust as she slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the stable yard with complete conviction. "Yes, it's true." Calder's relief was visible, but he maintained his composed demeanor as he continued. "Our marriage will provide Hope with a stable, two-parent household, legal protection from any future custody challenges, and the security of a loving family unit that includes the entire community of Willow Creek. A marriage of convenience," Robert said dismissively, though his earlier confidence had clearly been shaken. "Hastily arranged to circumvent legal proceedings. No court would view such an arrangement as genuine." "I suppose that depends," Dr. Matthews said mildly, "on how one defines genuine. I've observed Mr. Beck and Mrs. Hart for months now, and I can attest that any marriage between them would be based on deep mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection for both each other and the child in question." Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. "Anyone with eyes can see how much they care for each other and for that baby. If that's not genuine, I don't know what is." "Besides," Mrs. Henderson added with a slight smile, "we've all been expecting this announcement for weeks. The only surprise is that it took them this long to make it official." The murmur of agreement from the crowd suggested that Evelyn and Calder's feelings for each other had been more obvious to their neighbors than to themselves. The realization brought heat to her cheeks, but also a warm sense of community approval that strengthened her resolve. Robert looked around at the united front presenting itself against his plans, his legal documents suddenly seeming less powerful in the face of such organized opposition. "This is all very touching," he said with obvious frustration, "but it doesn't change the fundamental facts. The Hart family has legal standing to ensure their grandchild is raised with proper advantages." "What advantages would those be?" Calder asked with genuine curiosity. "A distant uncle and aunt who view her as a continuation of family legacy rather than as an individual worthy of love. A household where she would be a replacement for the son you lost in infancy rather than celebrated for who she is." The specific reference to Robert's own tragic loss, information that could only have come from Thomas during their brief marriage, hit its target with obvious impact. Robert's face flushed with anger and something that might have been pain. "How dare you?" "I dare because I love her," Calder interrupted, his voice carrying a conviction that silenced the other man's protest. "Not as a Hart heir or a family obligation, but as Hope, the specific, irreplaceable little girl who was born into this community and has already brought joy to everyone who knows her." He gestured toward the baby, sleeping peacefully in Evelyn's arms. "Look at her, Mr. Hart, really look at her. She's content, healthy, surrounded by people who chose to love her rather than people who feel obligated to claim her. Is your legal authority really worth disrupting that peace?" For the first time since his arrival, Robert's attention focused on Hope herself rather than on the legal and social abstractions surrounding her custody. The baby chose that moment to wake, opening her dark eyes and gazing around at the faces surrounding her with the alert curiosity that had become her hallmark. When her gaze found Calder's face, She made the soft cooing sound that had become her way of greeting him, and something that might have been recognition crossed Robert's features. Perhaps he saw Thomas in her alert expression, or perhaps he simply saw what everyone else could see, a baby who was clearly thriving under her current circumstances. "Sheriff Morrison," Evelyn said, finding her voice and her courage at the same time. "What would we need to do to make Mr. Hart's documents invalid? To ensure that Hope can remain here where she belongs?" The sheriff considered the question with the careful attention it deserved. "Marriage would certainly strengthen your legal position considerably. A stable, two-parent household, community, support, documented evidence of the child's well-being that would make any custody challenge much more difficult to pursue." He looked directly at Robert. "My advice, Mr. Hart, would be to return home and inform your family that the child is being well cared for by people who love her. Pursuing this matter further would likely be both expensive and unsuccessful, given the evidence of stability and support I've witnessed here today." As the crowd began to disperse, satisfied that the immediate threat had been neutralized, Evelyn found herself alone with Calder and the sleeping baby who had been the center of so much concern. The magnitude of what had just happened, the public declaration of engagement, the community's rallying support, the successful defense against Robert's legal challenge, was beginning to sink in. "Did we really just get engaged?" she asked quietly, hardly daring to believe the transformation their lives had just undergone. "I hope so," Calder replied, his voice soft with the vulnerability of someone who had just taken the biggest risk of his life. "Unless you object to the idea of marrying a broken-down cowboy with more past than future." "I don't object," she said, shifting Hope so she could reach for his hand. "I think I've been hoping for exactly this proposal for longer than I wanted." To admit, when their fingers intertwined, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if they had been meant to find each other across all the miles and months and heartache that had brought them to this moment. Hope stirred in her arms, and for the first time since her birth, Evelyn felt completely certain about the future they were building together, not just surviving, but thriving as a family chosen rather than inherited. Robert Hart left Willow Creek the following morning, his expensive buggy disappearing into the dawn mist like a bad dream finally fading. He departed without ceremony or farewell, taking with him his legal documents and his disappointed ambitions for claiming Hope as a Hart family prize. But before leaving, he had made one final attempt to change Evelyn's mind, approaching her as she fed Hope on Mrs. Patterson's front porch. "You know this won't last," he had said quietly, his voice carrying the tired certainty of someone who believed himself wiser than those around him. "Frontier marriages built on convenience rarely survive the first serious hardship. When the novelty wears off and reality sets in, you'll find yourself worse off than before, married to a man who took you out of pity, tied to a place that offers no real future." "You're wrong," Evelyn had replied with a calm that surprised them both. "This marriage isn't being built on convenience or pity. It's being built on something much stronger, on choice, on shared values, on the kind of love that grows from truly knowing and accepting another person. And if I'm right, if this backwoods romance crumbles under the weight of real life, what then for Thomas's daughter? Then we'll face whatever comes together as a family," she had answered. "But I'm not wrong about Calder, Mr. Hart. He's not the kind of man who makes promises lightly or abandons people when life gets difficult." Now, 24 hours later, as she stood in the small church at the center of Willow Creek, those words felt like prophecy rather than hope. The entire community had gathered for the wedding, transforming what might have been a simple civil ceremony into a genuine celebration of two people choosing to build a life together. Mrs. Patterson had worked miracles with Evelyn's limited wardrobe, transforming her best dress into something approaching bridal elegance, with the addition of delicate lace and tiny pearl buttons borrowed from various women in town. Mrs. Henderson had contributed a veil that had been her own grandmother's, while Mrs. Morrison had crafted a bouquet from the first spring flowers brave enough to bloom in the March cold. Hope, now just over a month old, slept peacefully in a basket near the altar, dressed in a tiny gown that Mrs. Patterson had stitched from the same fabric as her mother's dress. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This marriage wasn't just joining two individuals, but creating a family unit that included the child who had already won the heart of every person in the church. Calder stood at the front of the church, in his best suit, which had been pressed and mended until it looked nearly new. But it was his expression, rather than his clothing, that took Evelyn's breath away as she walked down the aisle. His eyes held none of the dutiful resignation she might have expected from a man marrying out of necessity. Instead, she saw joy, anticipation, and something so tender it made her heart race with possibilities she'd thought buried with Thomas. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Morrison began, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to the occasion, "we are gathered today to witness the union of Calder James Beck and Evelyn Rose Hart in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Evelyn like a blessing, but it was the way Calder reached for her hands that anchored her in the moment. His fingers were warm and steady, calloused from honest work but gentle in their touch. When she looked into his eyes, she saw not the shadow of obligation, but the light of genuine choice. "The vows these two will exchange today," Pastor Morrison continued, "represent not just promises between husband and wife, but the commitment to build a family founded on love, respect, and mutual support. They come to this union not as strangers, seeking convenience, but as friends who have chosen to become partners in life's journey." When it came time for Calder to speak his vows, he surprised everyone by setting aside the traditional words Pastor Morrison had prepared. Instead, he spoke from his heart, with the same honesty that had characterized every important conversation. "Between them, Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the small church, "when I offered you shelter last autumn, I thought I was simply helping a stranger in need. I never imagined that you would become the person who helped me find my way back to believing in good things, in the possibility of happiness I thought I'd lost forever." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I promise to love and protect not just you but Hope as well, to be the father she needs and the husband you deserve. I promise to honor Thomas's memory by raising his daughter to know the truth about his courage and your love for him. And I promise to build with you the kind of life where love is something we choose every day, not just something we declared." Once in a moment of need, the simple gold band he placed on her finger was new, purchased from the jeweler 2 towns over during a hasty trip he'd made the day before. But its meaning was ancient and enduring, a circle with no beginning and no end, representing the kind of commitment that could weather any storm. When Evelyn spoke her own vows, she found herself looking not just at Calder, but at the entire community that had gathered to support them. These people had become her family in ways that blood relations never had, and their presence here felt like a benediction on the choice she was making. "Calder," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, "you offered me shelter when I was lost, work when I needed purpose, and friendship when I thought I'd forgotten how to trust. But most importantly, you showed me that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, that opening my heart to you doesn't dishonor what I felt for Thomas, but honors it by proving that kind of love was real and lasting." She slipped a matching gold band onto his finger, marveling at how right it looked there. "I promise to be your partner in building something beautiful from the broken pieces we both carried here. I promise to love you not in spite of your past, but because of the man your experiences have made you. And I promise to raise Hope to understand that families are built through choice and commitment, not just chance and blood." When Pastor Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle but not tentative, a beginning rather than an ending, a promise of intimacy to be explored rather than a culmination of romance already spent. The celebration that followed was exactly what Evelyn had hoped for, joyful without being ostentatious, meaningful without being solemn. Mrs. Patterson had organized a reception in the church hall, with food contributed by every family in town and music provided by the farmers who gathered on Saturday nights to play fiddle tunes and sing the old songs. Hope woke during the festivities, alert and content to be passed from one admiring adult to another. Watching her daughter surrounded by people who already loved her, Evelyn felt a profound sense of completion. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just safety or security, but belonging. "Any regrets?" Calder asked during a quiet moment when they found themselves alone at the edge of the celebration. "Only that it took us so long to get here," she replied, then smiled at the surprise in his expression. "I think I started falling. In love with you that first day on the train platform when you helped a pregnant stranger without asking for anything in return. I just wasn't ready to admit it until now. And now I'm ready to build whatever comes next, together." As the evening wound down and the guests began to make their way home, Evelyn and Calder found themselves standing in the churchyard, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the clear March sky, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed contentedly in their pastures. "So," Calder said, his arm coming around his wife's shoulders with the easy familiarity of a gesture they would repeat thousands of times in the years to come, "what does Mrs. Beck think of her new life?" "Mrs. Beck," Evelyn replied, savoring. The sound of her new name thinks she's exactly where she belongs. They walked home together through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, past houses where lamplight spilled from windows and families settled in for the night. Behind them lay all the pain and uncertainty that had brought them to this moment. Ahead lay a future built on choice rather than chance, on love grown strong through adversity rather than weakened by it. Hope stirred in her arms as they reached their door, and Evelyn realized with a start that for the first time since leaving her old life, she had truly come home. Not to a place, but to a life, to a family she had chosen, and that had chosen her in return. 1 year later, on a warm afternoon in early spring, Evelyn Beck sat on the front porch of the house that Calder had built for their growing family. Hope toddled unsteadily across the wooden planks, her chubby hands grasping for the railing as she practiced the walking skills that had emerged seemingly overnight. At 15 months, she was a sturdy, confident child with Thomas's dark eyes and what appeared to be Calder's adventurous spirit. "Mama, up!" Hope demanded, raising her arms toward Evelyn with the imperious confidence of a child who knew herself to be deeply loved. "In a moment, sweetheart," Evelyn replied, setting down the letter she'd been reading. "Let Papa see how well you can walk to the gate and back." Calder looked up from the fence he was mending, his face lighting with the same wonder that had marked every one of Hope's milestones. "Come on, little bird," he called, using the nickname that had evolved from her early tendency to make soft cooing sounds. "Show me how fast those legs can carry you." Hope's delighted squeal as she toddled ran toward her father filled the afternoon air with pure joy. Watching them together, no observer would have questioned that Calder was anything other than Hope's devoted father. He had been present for her first smile, her first tooth, her first word, which had been Papa, much to Evelyn's amused chagrin. The letter in Evelyn's lap was from Margaret, who had finally made the journey west to meet her. Niece and see for herself the life her sister had built. Her visit the previous autumn had been a revelation for both sisters, opening conversations that had been closed for too long and healing wounds that had festered in silence. "Dearest Evelyn," the letter read, "I hope this finds you and your beautiful family in good health. Boston seems terribly grey and proper after the vibrant life I witnessed in Willow Creek. I find myself telling everyone about Hope's remarkable vocabulary and Calder's patient way of teaching her to identify birds and flowers. The photograph you sent of the three of you has a place of honor on my mantelpiece, and I show it to anyone who will stand still long enough. I have news that I hope will bring you closure. Robert Hart has abandoned his legal attempts to claim custody of Hope. The continued failure of his challenges, combined with his wife's growing understanding of what such a battle would mean for the child herself, has finally convinced him to let the matter rest. He asked me to convey his resignation to your chosen arrangements, though I suspect defeat might be a more accurate word. More importantly, I've been in correspondence with several people from your former hometown who wished to know how you were faring. The true story of Thomas's heroism has finally emerged, thanks largely to the child he saved speaking publicly about what happened that terrible day. Thomas is now remembered properly as the hero he was, and your marriage is spoken of with the respect it always deserved. Evelyn paused in her reading as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. For so long, she had carried the burden of knowing that Thomas's sacrifice had been hidden, his courage unacknowledged by the very people whose judgment had driven her away. To learn that truth had finally surfaced, that his memory was being honored as it should have been from the beginning, felt like a gift beyond measure. The sound of a buggy approaching drew her attention to the road, where Dr. Matthews was making his weekly rounds. At 73, he had begun training a younger man to eventually take over his practice, but he still insisted on personally checking on his favorite patients. "How's our Hope today?" he called as he climbed down from his buggy medical bag. "In hand, healthy as a horse and twice as energetic," Evelyn replied, rising to greet him. "Calder swears she's going to be riding before she's 2, the way she climbs on everything." Dr. Matthews chuckled as he examined Hope with the gentle efficiency of long practice. Strong heartbeat, clear eyes, excellent reflexes. This young lady is thriving exactly as she should be. He straightened, studying Evelyn with the same careful attention. "And how is her mother feeling these days?" "Very well," Evelyn replied, then decided to share the news she and Calder had been keeping to themselves for the past few weeks. "Actually, we have something to tell you. Hope is going to be a big sister come autumn." Dr. Matthews's weathered face broke into a delighted grin. "Well now, that's news worth celebrating. Calder must be over the moon." "He is," Evelyn confirmed, glancing toward her husband, who was swinging Hope high in the air while she giggled with pure delight. "We both are. This baby will be truly ours from the beginning, planned and wanted and welcomed by everyone." As if summoned by their conversation, Calder approached with Hope perched on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his hair for balance. "Doc," he greeted the older man with genuine warmth. "You staying for supper? Mrs. Patterson's bringing over her famous chicken and dumplings. Wouldn't miss it," Dr. Matthews replied. "Especially now that I hear there's going to be another little Beck to keep track of." The evening that followed was exactly the kind Evelyn had dreamed of during those lonely months of grief and uncertainty. Their home filled with friends who had become family, laughter echoing from every room, Hope charming everyone with her developing personality and obvious security in her place at the center of so much love. Later, after their guests had departed and Hope had been tucked into the beautiful wooden crib that Calder had crafted to replace her outgrown cradle, Evelyn and Calder sat together on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear spring sky. "I got another letter from Margaret today," Evelyn said, settling into the comfortable silence that had become one of their favorite evening rituals. "Robert Hart has finally given up his custody claims." "Good," Calder replied simply, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Though I can't say I'm surprised. Hard to argue that a child needs rescuing when anyone can see how happy and healthy she is. There's more. The truth about Thomas's death has finally come out back home. People know now that he died saving that child, that he was a hero." Calder was quiet for a moment, understanding the significance of this news for the woman who had carried the burden of hidden truth for so long. "I'm glad," he said finally. "Hope deserves to grow up knowing her father's real story." They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this peaceful evening. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate. "Do you ever wonder," Evelyn asked eventually, "what would have happened if my wagon wheel hadn't broken down that day? If I'd made it to Sweetwater, or wherever else I thought I was going?" "Every day," Calder admitted. "And every day I'm grateful that fate, or providence, or simple mechanical failure brought you here instead. I used to think I was running away from something," she mused. "But I think I was really running toward this, toward you, toward hope, toward the life we've built together." "Maybe both," Calder suggested. "Maybe sometimes we have to run away from the wrong thing before we can find the right one." A soft cry from inside the house indicated that hope was stirring in her sleep, and Evelyn rose to check on her daughter. She found the little girl sitting up in her crib, not distressed, but simply wanting company in the way of children who wake to find the world quieter than they prefer. "Mama," Hope said contentedly as Evelyn lifted her, settling immediately against her mother's shoulder with the complete trust that marked all her interactions with the adults who loved her. Standing there in the soft lamplight, holding her daughter, while her husband's voice drifted in from the porch as he spoke gently to the horses settling for the night, Evelyn felt a profound sense of completion. This was what happiness looked like, not the breathless excitement of first love, but the deeper satisfaction of a life built on solid foundations of choice, commitment, and daily acts of caring. Hope's breathing deepened as she drifted back towards sleep, and Evelyn carried her to the window that looked out over the rolling hills where Calder's cattle grazed peacefully under the starlight. Soon there would be another child to hold, another life to welcome into this community of love they had created. But for now, this moment was perfect, complete in itself, requiring nothing more than the simple recognition that sometimes the best things in life come not from having everything go according to plan, but from having the courage to embrace the unexpected gifts that arise from life's beautiful complications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to choose love over fear, hope over despair. But tonight, surrounded by the tangible evidence of dreams realized and promises kept, Evelyn Beck knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, home.